I'm going back to Ark Survival Evolved to take on the storyline's final map, Genesis 2. Not only does this map already contain some of the most challenging obstacles in the entire game, but on top of that, I've also decided to make it even harder on myself by adding my own challenges along the way, all while only having 100 days to beat Alpha Rockwell Prime. Genesis 2 takes place on a giant spaceship, and effectively splits up the map into two totally different sides. One side being relatively easy, resembling an absolute Ark paradise that you'd come to expect from any other Ark map. The other side, however, is significantly harder, resembling a terrifying science experiment gone horribly wrong. To make things worse, I was planning on starting our 100-day journey by spawning in on the harder side of the map. But before I do, here are the rules. 1. Genesis 2 gives you a free Tek Suit at spawn, but I'm not going to allow myself to use it yet, forcing me to play Gen 2 just like any other Ark map. 2nd, every 10 days, I must switch sides of the map, alternating between both the good side of the map and the bad side, forcing me to get creative and a little strategic about how I went about progressing and ultimately defeating the map. 3rd, every 10 days I complete, I will also unlock a mini reward to help with these two challenges along the way. With all of that being said, let's get into it. Since literally every spawn location on the bad side said very hard, I just decided to pick one at random. I ended up waking up on a strange alien world alongside a purple river surrounded by mutant plants. Thankfully, what I assumed were trees did still give wood, so I began gathering the resources in the area. Before long, I was able to craft the remnants of an outfit and some basic tools. Now that I was able to collect resources a bit easier, I turned my attention toward establishing a starting campsite. Pretty quickly, I was able to craft up some thatch components and started building a spot near the water's edge, all in an effort to get a shelter up before nightfall. I'm willing to do a lot of things in Ark, but playing early game and stranded in the dark isn't one of them. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Now, with a place to call home, I set out in search of things to hunt for hide, which, because I'm on the bad side, didn't leave me with a whole lot of options. Nighttime was nearly upon me when I located a dead below ready to harvest, plus a ton of ants. Then midnight came. You see, two things happened at midnight. First, because I knew this video was releasing near Christmas, I decided to enable the Christmas event to add some holiday cheer, which means every day at midnight, Raptor Claws would come to deliver gifts somewhere random on the map. Secondly, it meant the ship that the map takes place on would now be traveling to a new location. This will be important for later on. But for now, I spent the rest of the night hunting things for hide and cooking up the meat. The next morning, I left camp to do some resource gathering when tragedy struck. A pack of wild shadowmanes stumbled across my campsite and for some reason decided to just start tearing it apart. What makes things worse is one happened to see me in the process. No, please! Oh my god! Oh my god, okay. And just like that, the entirety of my day 1 progress was reversed. Yeah, maybe making this map harder was a mistake. Luckily, I was able to retrieve my bag after our eviction before having to search for a safer place to live. I ended up coming across an island in between 2 waterfalls and figured that would be an easier area to defend. So this time, I worked on setting up a wooden cabin. I was hard at work when I realized the pond in front of my house was full of Eurypterids. But after already being evicted once, I wasn't going to let this happen again. So doing battle with the sea scorpions became a must. Luckily for me, it was fairly easy and I was able to pour all of my effort back into constructing a new cabin. It took quite a few trips back and forth and a few skirmishes with things, but eventually by late night I had managed to make a fairly fortified starting base. And more or less I had replenished what I had lost from the day prior. I started off the morning of day 3 by converting the meat I had been spoiling into narcotic, which all in all gave me enough for quite a few trank arrows. And now that I actually had the ability to do some taming, I figured it was time to set off in search of recruits. The first tameable thing I came across was a level 24 Tek Parasaur, which granted isn't great, but I needed help badly. And having a berry gatherer in any form would be huge right now. So I knocked it out. While that began to tame, I realized I'd need 80 hide just to craft it a saddle, which now meant it was time to hunt again. And as we all already found out, that can be kind of a tall order in this area. Thankfully, I ran across a moss chops, and because it's not aggressive, I was able to kill it pretty easily. But more importantly, it provided the hide I was desperately needing. On the way back, I found a level 168 Tek Parasaur, which is night and day better. In Ark, you always have to be willing to accept an upgrade when you find it. And I just had to have it, so I made a point to bullet it and knock this one out as well. Once out, I continued to make our way back to our first Parasaur and gave it the saddle. Then I named him Glenn and used it to farm some berries for the sleeping high-level parasaur on the other side. I was also able to do a bit more hunting while I waited, but eventually she tamed out and I named her Betsy. I decided to give Betsy Glenn's saddle because she was stronger, and together we made our way back home. Be grateful the last one was torn apart. Oh! Oh my god! Oh no! Oh my god! Oh my god! What the hell? Oh my god! What the hell? No! 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 What the hell, dude? Oh! Kill it! Please! Oh my god! Oh my god! Oh my god! The jump scare! Oh my god! After the ambush, I decided to spend the rest of day 3 harvesting material around camp. That way I could build a refining forge and smelt down the little metal I did have. Now with that smelting, I spent some time harvesting rocks in the pond looking for more metal. By sundown, I had enough to craft a smithy. With a smithy in my possession, I was now able to get my hands on a metal pick, which I then used to harvest some nearby crystal. All in all, this just turned out to be one of those super productive days we all like to have at Ark. I started off day 4 by crafting up a spyglass with the crystal and waiting for some meat to spoil so I could add more narcotic to our loot. And with the additions of Betsy and Glenn, this task became markedly easier. After I had a fair bit of narcotic crafting up, I started to work on getting a taming pen assembled, which would require some stone pieces to work properly. And since it was only day 4, I was going to have to harvest it all by hand. With that goal now in mind, I decided to make a metal hatchet to help speed up the process. I also built a crossbow for protection before setting out to chop at the rocks in the area. It took quite a few trips of going back and forth, dropping off loads of stone, but by early afternoon I was able to start building a basic taming pen above the waterfall below my base. With that now in place, I started prepping to brave the wilderness and tame some muscle by making hide armor and placing a bed. On top of that, I made up as many trank arrows as I possibly could. It didn't take me long to spot a level 156 Tek stego wandering around the valley outside. Stegos are also pretty slow, so I was able to walk it back to my pen fairly easily. Downside though is stegos have lots of natural armor, which made knocking it out take a ton of time. After many shots, it went down, which led me to the other giant downside. Berry taming a high-level stego like this would take even longer to do. So as inconvenient as it was, I was now going to be in for a wait. In the meantime, however, I still had to get more done. So first, I picked off 2 nearby packy rhinos for the hide and crafted up a stego saddle. By now it was getting pretty late, and not wanting to be that far from base because of wild packs of shadow mains, I decided to just spend the night collecting mats like wood, stone, and metal for later. On the morning of day 5, I noticed a 130 frog that seemed to be stuck, and because we were still in desperate need of help, I figured we may as well tame that as well. This time, easily enough, we knocked him out and got some meat for it. Now that I was waiting for not 1 but 2 things to tame, I figured I'd spend some time taking Betsy out to scout around the nearby area to try and get a better idea of my surroundings, and what would be the best option to progress. I was really hoping to find a flyer, but didn't see a single one the entire time I was out. And by this point, our frog had tamed, so I went back to base to fetch him. I then realized in order to make a saddle for this, I would need cementing paste, which I did make, but I was also now out of hide. So I took a trip out to get even more hide, when I spotted a level 95 Pteranodon. This was exactly what I needed. So I waited for it to land before I bulleted it and started trying to knock it out. However, a nearby mantis took notice and attacked, immediately starting to eat my flyer. Unfortunately, I was not really up to this fight just yet, so I just cut my losses and went back home. Back at base, I named our frog Obi and made him up that saddle. The same time that was going down, the stego finally tamed out. I was planning on using him as a tank, so I took him out of the pen and tested his battle prowess. As expected, he was pretty strong, but he was also very slow. I decided to name him Blaine and spent the night fighting things to better level up our battle stag. Early morning day 6, I decided to take Blaine on a trip across the map in order to find some sort of flyer, because as long as I was landlocked, progressing would be real tough. And it turns out, thanks to the natural armor of the stego, Shadowmans couldn't stun me off of it. So, unbeknownst to me, stegos are probably the safest tame to be walking around this side of the map with. On the flip side though, stegos are impressively slow-moving tames. So the journey was grueling. It took most of the day, but eventually I did come across a Pteranodon that was higher than level 20 at level 85, which isn't the most jaw-dropping level for a flyer, but I was pretty tired of waddling around on a stego, and after putting him down for a snooze, I was able to make a saddle thanks to harvesting the things we fought along the way. Not wanting to take a chance and lose this one, I protected it until it was all the way tamed out. Thanks to the HLNA robot that follows you around on this map, I was also able to pick up a quick cryopod to store Blaine in. I named our new winged boy Hope and instantly took to the air to fly home. And when I said that waddling around on the stego was a grueling trip, I really meant it because it ate up most of my entire day. Because by the time I got home, it was late night. But I figured that since I could now move around, I'd try to find some of Santa's drops. Sadly, there were no drops on my side, but instead I found a Christmas miracle. There was a 150 Pteranodon high in the air, above the cliffs. This was already way better than Hope was currently, so I committed to bowling and knocking it out. With it being so high in the air though, it took a while to find a place to land, and it was the next morning by the time I actually managed to trank it out. With it being a level 150 tame, I figured it would probably be worth it using prime meat instead to tame it up. So I lured a nearby stego into the taming pen, and after turning it into a pincushion, turned it into prime. Thanks to the grade A meat, by mid-morning our new bird was now awake. I very appropriately decided to name her Miracle and brought her home. Now that I could travel further safely and a whole lot faster, it was time to do a much needed metal run. Pteranodons don't have the best weight, but with both of them together I was able to bring back a small metal run. And with that now in the forge smelting, I figured I could go check out some drops. You see, on Gen 2, drops are actually good and have the chance to give some pretty crazy items, depending on the color. Today, I didn't come across anything too crazy outside of materials and some metal dino gates. But with the extra bit of material I had found, I was able to make gateways for the gates, and we effectively had ourselves a dino trap, plus some cementing paste and spark powder. Beginning day 8, I had just enough to make a fabricator. Thanks to the drops from the prior day, we had a working trap. So today, I took it into the mountains to see if I could find an RG. Out here, RGs are everywhere, so I was able to locate a good level bird pretty quick, which was huge. And thanks to our new metal gates, I was able to pretty routinely trap and knock it out. I even killed a few of the surrounding RGs for the prime. The hard part though would be crafting a saddle. RG saddles require a lot of chitin, and after the Pteranodon saddles, I was pretty much out. But I had an idea. Since Eurypterids were spawning in the water around my base, and they classify as bugs, our frog Obi would be able to kill and harvest them pretty easy thanks to the bug buff it gets. However, when I did come in contact with them, Obi would pretty much annihilate them. Thanks to our frog strategy, I was able to craft the RG saddle and fly back before it tamed out. The new RG tamed out later that day, and I named him Smoker. With an actual durable tame in my ranks, it made it way safer to traverse the bad side of Gen 2. Around nighttime, I saw a 140 Volanosaur walking around, and at this point I still really needed help defending my base in case of Shadow Main attack, which as I learned the hard way could easily happen. So having Nature's Auto Turret on my side could be worth it, if I could knock it out without getting shot to pieces, that is. But with a tremendous amount of caution and an intense game of cat and mouse, I was able to sleep him. Before leaving it to tame out, I also found a 140 Enki on the way home, and at the moment we had no other farming dinos. And frankly, I just couldn't pass it up, so I carried it home to our taming pen and knocked it out as well. Day 9, and thanks to our self-imposed challenges, this was going to be the last day I had before leaving all our stuff behind and traveling to the other side for the next 10 days. So with that in mind, I made saddles for our sleeping Enki and Velo before heading out to pick up our new guard dog. I decided to set up the Volanosaur on the ledge overlooking our pond so that he could see the whole area and shoot at any invading creatures. Because for those who don't know, this dino can literally shoot at things like an automatic turret. Thanks to this new cabin being built on top of a small plateau, I really only had to worry about being invaded from one side though, which was easy enough to build. With the base now being reinforced and fortified, my plan was now to do some metal runs and start smelting in bulk. That way when I did return, I'd already have metal ready and waiting. So I used the remainder of this time to do just that. I even killed off a few Alpha Raptors, which gave me some nice gear upgrades I could come back to. I finished off the day by making sure the Enki would finish taming up while I was away and dropping all of our gear in a box before morning. Day 10. It was time to change sides for the next 10 days. Just getting out of the bad side of the map was a good enough reward to me so far for the first 10 days. But that being said, we now had a new set of obstacles to face. Since it was going to be a while before we unlocked the ability to travel freely between both sides, it meant we would now need to effectively set up another outpost and set of tames for this side of the map. The good news is because I already had our levels and experience from the last 9 days, I could effectively speedrun the beginning of Ark process. So I set out in Eden to find a good place to set up camp. While searching around on foot, I made basic gear to help get us going, including a bow and arrows. Plus I found a red drop which supplied crystal for a spyglass and even some fancy grass pants. This side of the map is a lot safer, so I could actually afford to run around unaccosted. I ended up locating a ledge just above a riverbed, which would be perfect for starting out on this side. So I worked quick to set up another temporary cabin to work out of, except this time I added a deck with a trapdoor and ladders for easy river access. Then I gathered stone and hide so I can make a mortar and pestle and a refining forge. A huge perk of building alongside a river is the easy access to the river rocks, which do give a bit more metal when harvested opposed to the other rocks. Thanks to this, I was able to stockpile a small surplus of metal. Once smelted down, I was able to make a new smithy and some storage. With the rest of my time, I farmed mats, hunted critters, and made more arrows, until I find a low-level Megaloceros. And needing a new bout of friends, I began Ark's friendship ritual by clubbing it. Yeah. Luckily, thanks to the early material gathering, I had enough stuff to make this thing a saddle. And since now I was stuck playing a little bit of the waiting game, I figured I'd spend the rest of the night gathering as much metal as I could. By dawn, my Megaloceros had fully tamed up. I decided to name him Stan, and then immediately found out that moose don't gather berries for some reason. But that's okay, it still gathers thatch like a machine. Unfortunately, that now meant I'd have to pick berries by hand for narcotic, which did take longer. Still, it had to be done. And now with some narcotic on the way, I tried upgrading my tools, only to realize I was out of hide. However, I was still able to make a crossbow. Then I took young Staniel out for a bit of hunting. What Stan lacks in power, he definitely makes up for with tenacity. With his help, I was easily able to provide the hide we needed for the metal tools. At this point, I was still in need of a berry gatherer, so I crafted up some ammo and headed out in hopes of remedying the situation. I ended up running directly into a 140 trike. Thanks to Ark Survival Evolved's inferior pathing abilities, I was able to stand on a cliff and essentially knock him out for free. Again, berry taming high-level herbivores does take time to do. So while I waited, I made him a saddle, then started farming mats for a trap. After grinding out the trap, I decided to run off into a nearby meadow. I was hoping to use our new trap on a high-level Maywing. Finding good levels was easy, but getting one into my trap without it running away was a lot harder to do. Admittedly, I did struggle and I probably should have used billboards instead, because it was nearly sunset before I had successfully managed to get one trapped and tranked out. On this side of the map, Ovis are everywhere. So tracking one down for mutton to feed the Maywing didn't take too long. Early that night, the Maywing tamed out, and I decided to name him Red Velvet because of his sleek red coat. On the way back home, we stopped to pick up our new trike who had also tamed out. Back at home, I decided to name the trike Thistle before going on a berry rampage for more narcotic. Being satisfied with their drug production, I now turned my interest to building a Maywing saddle. You see, Maywings are one of the fastest flyers in Ark. If you can even call them flyers, they more realistically fall with style, but they do it really fast. And since now we had access to this new fast traveling ability, I figured what better way to use it than to collect a few drops before calling it a night. The next day I made more trank arrows with our freshly produced narcotic, then set out to do both scouting for tames and some drop collecting, which immediately started bearing fruit because I found some better gear, saddles, oil, and most importantly, hard polymer. The loot was great, but I just couldn't find any RGs. So I decided to pull up the spawn map so I could have a better idea on where to locate one. With its help, I headed over to an area where I should have been looking all along, because sure enough, there were RGs aplenty and I was able to spot myself a level 145 bird. Using the same trap as before, I knocked her out and started the tank. Back at base, I decided to drop off our loot. And since drops on this map had the chance of giving you some absolutely insane things, I figured I'd go grab a couple more. But I didn't get anything too crazy. After that, I was looking at trying to make a fabricator, and I realized I was actually pretty close. This gave me an idea, because surely there were beavers on this side of the map. And if I could find beavers, I'd find dams, which would mean easy cementing paste. So once again, I pulled up the spawn map to figure out where exactly beavers did spawn, and set out on Red Velvet to try and find some dams. I did end up coming across a couple of dams in a stream, but not a ton. Not wanting to come back empty-handed though, I decided to grab a bit of metal and checked a few more drops during the evening. That night it was the first time I actually noticed Raptor Claws dropping gifts on my side of the map. So of course I had to go open his gifts. Thanks to Raptor Claws, I finally had okay armor and a bunch of resources to take home. On the morning of day 13, I began smelting my metal for the fabricator. Then I headed out to collect the RG that had tamed up during the night. Except on the way there, I spotted a 145 Doad being eaten by not one, but 2 different Alpha Raptors. Not really being equipped to deal with that situation yet, I decided to make a mental note to see if it lived later. After that, I picked up our new RG and called her Gale. I couldn't help myself from checking a couple drops on the way back, but I still couldn't find anything special. At camp, I made Gale a saddle, and now that I had some muscle with me, I decided I should probably go back to see if that 145 Doad had lived or not. Because having something that could gather stone like that would be a huge help at this point in the game. Back at the scene of the crime, I actually found out there were 3 Alpha Raptors running together in a pack, which is just outrageous. Even crazier than that, though, was the Doad was still alive thanks to his defensive abilities. So I unpacked Gale and put Red Velvet away, then swooped in to save him. Luckily, I had managed to bring her home safely, and I used HLNA to see what its health was at, because trying to tame a Doad that has taken some damage and balled itself up takes an insane amount of time to do. So unfortunately, this guy would need to heal a great deal. At least now, though, he could sit and heal in my yard for a while without being bullied by 3 different Alpha Raptors. The next thing on my to-do list was trying to acquire a mammoth for wood. I had spotted a few earlier while out collecting drops, so I knew where to look. And to my surprise, I came face to face with a 150 in the wild. This actually ended up being the first 150 anything I had seen so far. So clearly, this was now my top priority, and I instantly began setting up a trap to try and shrink it out easier. I ended up being able to pin it to the side of a cliff and put it out without too much drama. With a well-placed belly flop from Red Velvet, I had a ton of berries for this thing to eat as well. But if we're speaking of slow herbivore tames, this one was going to take the longest by far. Then I even tried killing an Alpha T-Rex, only to find out it had an Alpha Raptor friend hanging out with him as well. I was able to kill the Raptor, but the Rex was a little too powerful for me to deal with right now. So instead, I decided to go home and craft up that fabricator we were working for. That night, I still needed cementing base, so I checked the map one more time for beaver spawns. But again, I was only able to locate a few more beaver dams, which is better than nothing, but it also wasn't the haul I was hoping for. Overall, it still wasn't a bad haul to get before retiring for the night. For some reason, even though this side is known as the easier side, I kept finding alphas everywhere, so I started off the next day by taking out another Alpha Raptor. This one, though, did give me a journeyman crossbow. I was hoping this new crossbow would help me knock out the Doad back at home walking around my yard. Unfortunately, it was a little too powerful, though, because while I was shooting it, it balled itself up again, and now would have to heal itself up even more. With that falling through, I decided to do another metal run with Gale before coming home, setting up a second porch to smell even faster, then making a handful of campfires so I could get a head start on charcoal production. At this point, I was really wanting to stay near base so the Doad would continue to heal itself. Trying to keep that in mind, I just went around doing some housekeeping until nightfall. That night, I left to grab a few drops and another round of Raptor Claws gifts so I could add to my collection. Sunrise on day 15, and the mammoth was tamed up and ready to go. I decided to call him Trumpet, and I brought him back to base where I saddled him up and took him on an immediate lumber run to raise our wood stocks. After my wood drive, I realized that the Doad was up and wandering around again. So for a second time, I attempted to knock it out. And for a second time, it balled up. But this time, it wasn't taking no for an answer, because thanks to HLNA, I could tell we were very close. So I elected to grit my teeth and try to get it out. It ended up taking all of my arrows, and even a second set of arrows, until finally, success was had and taming could begin. After finally getting a knockout on the Doad, I really wanted to just scout around to see if I could find anything else to tame. However, I was largely unsuccessful in finding anything helpful besides a drop or two, which, as every Ark player knows, does tend to happen sometimes. I had lost most of my day to the search when my path crossed ways with a level 145 Thyla. I decided to pick it up with Gale, and since RGs are very slow, it took me the rest of my daylight hours just to get home with it, where I dropped it into the river while I constructed a poor man's taming pen. It definitely wasn't a pretty build, but I figured it would still work. Thylas are one of the only tames in the game that prefer cooked food, and not just any cooked food, cooked mutton. Because of that, I decided I should go out, find a sheep, grab some mutton, and put it on the barbecue. That way I would have some food on hand when this thing did knock out. And now that I had some mutton cooking up at my base, I figured it was time to light up the big cat with arrows and start the tame. The next morning, I did a quick berry gathering with Trumpet, making sure to grab as many narco berries as I could to help keep the Thyla asleep. Then I grabbed Gale and set out in order to try and knock out another metal run. On the way home, I spotted a level 130 Anki, and I figured it was probably best if I had a second Anki on this side of things as well. So I brought him home with me and proceeded to try and knock it out in my front yard. With the Anki going down for a nap, I realized I now had 3 sleeping beasts on my lawn. And since I was playing the waiting game now, I figured it would be a good time to start moving our camp to our actual base location on this side of the map. During my travels near the middle city, I found a lake connected to a neat-looking land bridge and waterfall. For those of you who don't know, I am a sucker for a water feature in a base location. So this spot hooked me instantly. Plus, it was more centralized to the map, which would be way more convenient later on. What wasn't convenient was having to move all of my possessions from one area to the other. The fact that I was only sporting one RG did not help this situation at all. But it had to get done one way or the other, so I began the arduous process of ferrying things over. It ended up being pretty slow going, but at least both the Thyla and the Doa teamed up later that day. I decided to name the Doa Blue Ball for obvious reasons, and the Thyla Oakheart, and if you get the reference, let me know. Besides that though, the move took my full attention. Moving over all the resources I had been stockpiling this entire time actually took me through the entire night and into the next day to finish. By mid-morning the next day, I had done it, and everything was moved over. But this led me to my next grind. I only had a few days remaining before I'd have to switch sides again, and I wanted to make sure I had this base fully constructed before I left. So with this goal now in mind, I used day 17 to farm mats and craft the builds I needed. Deciding to save this 145 Doa and spending all that time trying to tame it ended up being the right play because I used it a lot. Also, having a creature like Trumpet that could not only help me gather wood and thatch, but could also carry a large amount of weight with it, really helped enhance the collection process. During the day, the Anki also finished taming up, so I retrieved him and bestowed onto him the name of Francis, before going back and continuing my resource grind. That night, I followed up our day's resource grind by doing a crystal run with Francis, because I had some construction pieces in mind that just needed glass. After feeling satisfied with what I was able to collect, I then decided to come home and plan better how I was going to make this build work. Day 18 was base building day. I really wanted this build to be located evenly on the land bridge in front of the waterfall. So because of this, it took me a bit to line it up evenly in the middle. But once I had, I was off to the races. I was feeling kind of nostalgic while playing ASC, and I had an old build in mind. I started by making parts of the floor out of glass and the other parts out of stone so we could fully enjoy the water. Then I started making the walls out of stone doorways, railings, and greenhouse doors. I even spent the extra time to add in the pillars just to give it that open floor plan vibe. Now, this isn't necessarily the hardest build I've ever done, but ASC's building mechanics are way worse than the upgraded version on ASA. So it took me longer than expected to complete and get all the little details in to make it look good. However, with that being said, by nightfall I had everything done except the roof and the glass doors. But at this point I was kind of in need of a brain break, so I left to collect some presents before getting back into it that morning. The next day I put the roof on our base, complete with its glass topper. With that being done, I had to do one final crystal run with Francis in order to make all the greenhouse doors I was going to use as windows for our base. But with those details added, finally our Eden base was finished. And personally, I think it came out great. Next, I started moving all our stuff inside, starting with the mortar and pestle area, then moving in the fabricator and smithy. Next, I picked a spot to line up all the refining forges, and finally, I got a preserving bin set up as well. One of the last things I added was a storage area for all of the things I'd collected up to this point. The very last thing I placed in this base was a cryo fridge I had found in a drop earlier. With the base 100% done, I only had a few in-game hours left to prep before having to change sides. So I made a feeding trough and did a meat run with Oakheart and then a berry run with Trumpet to ensure all our tames wouldn't starve. I even rearranged all the tames into organized looking positions. Feeling good about what I was able to achieve in these last 10 days, I decided to go celebrate by picking up a few of Santa's gifts to close out the day. Day 20. Unfortunately, it was time to go back over to the bad side. However, my reward for this 10 days was to pick one tame and allow it to travel with me between the sides. Having at least one tame that could travel with me would be a huge help. And to me, there was no better option than Red Velvet, our Maywing. Being able to traverse the bad side safely and with ease seemed invaluable right now. So Red Velvet was who I chose to prestige. And with our Maywing, it was off to the bad side we went. No one had died or gotten hurt while I was away, which was great news. After grabbing my old kit from the storage box, I had a new task in mind. I wanted to craft a net gun in order to 1. Better protect myself out here, and 2. Make taming a whole lot easier. Since there are no beaver dams on this side, I'd have to make cementing paste instead. Plus, I needed polymer. So step 1 would be hunting down some mantis. While looking for mantises, I found a drop that had primitive riot pants and 5 adobe behemoth gates, both of which were big upgrades to our current situation. While out, I also came across some obsidian, and we were also going to need that, so I snagged that on the way. Eventually, I did come across a few mantises that I was able to take out with Smoker. With all of these ingredients assembled together, I had enough to craft my harpoon and a few nets. After getting that drop with the behemoth gates, I had a new idea in mind. Unfortunately, I also needed more mats to pull that off, so out I went for wood and stone. With the wood and stone collected, I used it to make 2 doors for our behemoth gateways. I figured that since we had been gifted some behemoth gateways, I could probably use it as an even bigger version of the trap I was already using. And I wanted to see if I could try and tame a Quetzal. So I went out looking for the big bird that afternoon, and I searched a large part of the map looking for them. I stayed out until nightfall searching, but for whatever reason, I just couldn't seem to find one. With it being pretty late, I decided to come back to base and save all our trap components for later, if I ever did manage to find one. I did end up finding a chainsaw though, so it wasn't all bad. On day 21, I noticed a 145 doad out in the wild, and after harvesting stone by hand all day yesterday, I could definitely use one. And it was just my luck, because this one was also hurt. As I learned the hard way, this was gonna have to do some healing before I attempted to tame it. So I dropped him off in my tame pen for now where he'd be nice and safe. That's when I noticed that the Enki I tamed on day 9 was still here. And frankly, it was kind of a good surprise. So I pulled him out of the taming pen and named him Francisco. After that, I realized I had a new problem on my hands though. Now that I knew exactly where my other base was located, I realized our current camp wouldn't work in the future. This was because our current Rockwell camp was super far away from my Eden base. And in order to save both time and energy, I kind of wanted both our outposts to be somewhat close together. That way we'd have easy access to both later on. So today I spent a large part of the day scouting out multiple areas of the map we could use to set up shop in. Eventually I managed to narrow down the ideas I had and found a spot close to the middle that was elevated and seemingly safe. And learning from last time, I decided instead of moving literally everything I had occurred in this time, I'd instead grab just the essentials. During the process of moving over our dinos and our essentials, I also came across a Mastercraft fabricated sniper rifle blueprint. In ASE, this thing was a monster and would be huge help later, so I had made sure to stow it for later. It did take me the remainder of that night to get pretty much everything we would need over here as well, plus the remainder of our dinos. Beginning day 22, I decided to make a new open platform area so we would have an effective workstation that we could work out of while on this side of things. That way it also gave me a place to start unpacking our stuff. In the morning, I needed to do one more trip back to the old camp. So I knocked that out first so I'd have all of my tames together in one place instead of in 2 different areas. Once my family was whole again, I continued working on my workstation platform, adding a smithy and getting all my other resources moved in. At this point in time, I was going through a bunch of flu symptoms in real life, and I was really starting to feel incredibly nauseous. I at least wanted to finish out this day though, so I picked an easy task and decided to snag drops for the remainder of the day. By and large, I'll admit most of these drops were pretty basic. But at the same time, at least I was building up a good pile of things for when I got a grinder set up. But I did end up coming across a few riot pieces. While out, I even came across a mana garmer, which really surprised me because I didn't realize they existed on this map at all. But the real gem came at the end of the night when I managed to pull an entire chemistry bench out of a drop. Obviously, this was a huge pull, especially to use on this side of the map. So, all in all, not bad for just a sick day. The next day I was feeling better, so I started by adding the chem bench to the work pad. And feeling productive, I also made some beer barrels to try and get ahead of brewing beer. After getting the barrels down, I remembered that I had a doed at the old base waiting to be tamed. Luckily for me, despite all this time, it still hadn't despawned yet. So I made up some tranks and yet again had to grit through another doed's defenses before I was able to knock it out. On the way back home, I also managed to pick up a new t-shirt. Back at base, I continued to focus on my beer barrels by starting to run the water pipes in order to get them irrigated. Once that was done, I did a quick berry run with Blaine in order to get the berries needed for our brew. Feeling good that I now had beer on the way, I decided now I should probably go out for some organic polymer and some tech dinos. Because in order to keep advancing into the tech age, I was gonna need polymer and electronics. While out during my hunt, Santa also decided to visit my side tonight, so I had to take advantage of that as well by the end of the night. The next day, I continued to strive forward into industrialization by making gas plus a generator. Then I headed out to do a metal run with Francisco in order to restock up on some metal. Whilst that was smelting, I found a pair of dung beetles and a 145 velo. After thinking about it, I figured the beetles could probably help stave off our oil needs, so I began taming these up. I also decided to try and tame up that velo because this new base, while being elevated, still had dangerous things spawning below. And frankly, it was really starting to stress me out a bit to see Shadowmane so close to my base. So I'd take any extra help I could get. Once the velo was down for the count, I started taming up the second dung beetle as well. But while I was in the middle of that, I noticed that the doe that we had knocked out was about to wake up. So I had to do a race against the clock in order to get back to it, narc it up, and then come back to our base where I could continue taming our beetle. That evening, our second velo had tamed up, and I took him home where I could get him set up. That way we could have 2 sets of turrets trying to protect our base. Now that I had 2 velos watching over the base, I felt a little bit safer, so for the rest of the day, I decided to pen in our dung beetles and call it a night. In the morning of day 25, I reorganized my tames, and then I set out to pick up my doa that finished taming during the night, whom I'm not sure why, but I decided to call Lump. Back at base, I combined the help of Smoker and Lump in order to grab a whole new load of stone, which I then used in my new chemistry bench in order to start crafting up some cementing paste. Reason being is I was going to try and attempt to make that Mastercraft fabricated sniper rifle blueprint we had found earlier. I was still going to need even more cementing paste to do this though. So seeing that I was still short, I decided to take Obi out for more chitin and trilobite kills. Later, I once again made a row of campfires and set out to get wood for them, that way I could burn it and start mass producing charcoal to make gunpowder in the future. After which I went out for a second round of stone in order to make more cementing paste. At this point, I was kinda tired of grinding, so I left to do some drop scouting, which was definitely starting to become an obsession of mine. By and large, I got a lot of stuff destined for the grinder, but I did stumble upon a heavy turret I could use to help try and protect my base if things got dire. While out, I got lucky and Raptor Claws came again to my side. And I had an idea I wanted to do later on in the video, and in order to make this idea happen, I would need all the mistletoe I could get my hands on. So obviously, I had to go grab some presents. The next day, I made a row of industrial forges to speed up my metal production. Once that was done, I decided to spend some time building a Plant Species X turret tower because I was starting to see more and more Shadowmane spawn in below my base, and that was really starting to give me anxiety. But thanks to our new dung beetles, I did have some fertilizer, and I was able to extend our water pipes from our beer barrels over to the new plant turret, which meant now all I had to do was wait for it to grow. Now I was feeling a touch more confident about my frontline defense situation. So I left to do a metal run to fill all the new forges and get some nearby crystal. I was gearing up to do another metal run when I came across a level 135 Ark Quetzal, which immediately became my new goal. So I went back to base to collect my kit from earlier and make a few more parachutes. The plan was I was going to jump off my RG, shoot it with the net gun midair, and pull my parachute before hitting the ground. Then I was going to race over and place our behemoth gates and gateways around it, effectively trapping it in a cage, all before it got out of the net. Except this time the Quetzal landed in a tree, so of course I couldn't get a trap around it. The next morning I regrouped to try it again. This time I managed to nearly get the full trap around it, but it still escaped the net and got away. On my third attempt though, it worked, as I was able to get all 3 phases of my plan to work flawlessly. This resulted in the big bird waking up inside my cage of gates. And now that it was stuck, I could calmly knock it out. Once asleep, I left to find some prime meat for it, which I found in the form of an Alpha Raptor. Once it was fed, I ran into a second Alpha Raptor, and I figured I should probably kill this one too, just for any extra experience I could get. Shortly after, I returned to my base to pick up where I had left off, by going out to retrieve the metal load I had abandoned yesterday. On the way back, I had to re-narc out the Quetzal because his teleport was dropping pretty quick. By that night, I was able to load up and get all my other forges going again though. And I did check to see if Santa was back, but unfortunately he wasn't on my side today. So instead I picked up a few mid drops from the grind pile and called it a day. In the morning of day 28, I started by making some gas for the generator. This made me realize I needed a better way to keep my dung beetles loaded with feces so that I could keep getting more oil. And that meant it was time to go get a Phiomia. For most Ark playthroughs, finding a Phiomia is no big deal. But on Genesis 2, specifically on the bad side, this felt impossible. I ended up struggling so hard to find one that I even pulled up their spawn map. And to my surprise, there were only a few spots they could actually spawn. Armed with this new information, I set out again. It still took me a bit, but finally I had found one. And I brought him back to base, where I promptly forgot about my velos, who instantly destroyed my new pig. Oh, wait. Oh, I didn't even think about it. Yeah. So regrettably, I had to go look again. But by the grace of God, I managed to find another one. This time I brought it to a neutral site to knock it out and tame it up. After a rather strange and confusing day, I had finally managed to bring myself poop out the Phiomia. Back at home, I finally remembered I had found a chainsaw earlier, and still needing polymer for my rifle, I went out to get a few mantises. Now that I was using a chainsaw, it went pretty quick. But by that night, I was still about 500 short of making my rifle. In the morning, I converted my chitin into paste. Then I set out to find some obsidian. I ended up finding some near the water's edge, but it was real dangerous here, so I decided to keep searching. I was able to find more on the side of a mountain, and this was a much larger cluster than before. Once gathered, I sped back to base to start converting into polymer, which in the end added up to nearly 300, so I still needed about 200 more. So back to mantis carving I went when I realized my Quetzal had tamed. When I went to pick him up, he reminded me heavily of Taruk Maktal from Avatar. So that's exactly what I decided to brand him. Then right back to bug collecting I went. Later that day, with all my polymer now combined, and with the next wave of chitin now being paste, I had just enough for the rifle. Now that that was done, I set my mind to a new task. I started trying to craft as much gunpowder as I could. That way I could produce ammo for my heavy turret. Since tomorrow was day 30, I wanted this base to be as protected as possible while I was gone. I also did a meat run to refill my trough. Then I did a berry run to help feed the trough, and I fed the stem berries to the Phiomia in order to make feces in bulk for the dung beetles. With the dung beetles full and happy, I decided to feed the rest of the narco berries I had into the chemistry bench to make more narcotic. And once again, you guessed it, I capped this night off with a present run for mistletoe. Day 30, which meant it was once again time to switch sides. This time around, our reward was to unlock 3 more creatures you could use to travel with you between the sides. After thinking about it a bit, I figured this would be better used on a return trip on day 40. So I elected just to save it for now and journeyed across the gap to our Eden base. Once back at home, I picked up our other kit and grabbed Francis to Gale to knock out a metal run because on this side of things, I was pretty much out. And with another bout of metal going, I figured I should probably check for beaver dam spawns since they were now available to me again. On the way over, I found a riot chest piece in a green job. However, I didn't see a single dam here, so instead I decided to knock out a 140 Sarco as a consolation prize. After putting this gator down for a nap, I went to grab some prime from another Sarco down at the lake when a tragedy happened. Oh no! What were you doing? I just killed a 135 otter with a pickaxe? Oh. Once fed, I did a bit more searching before conceding defeat and heading home to put my loot away. At base, I decided to make another net gun because they are kind of useful just to have on hand. Then I took Gale out to find an Alpha Raptor I had spotted on the coast on the way home, just for a little bit more experience. While down here on the coast, though, I also found an Ovis, so I figured I should probably bring the mutton over to our sleeping gator friend. That night, once again, I went to add more mistletoe to our collection, but Santa actually managed to bring me some heat for once. Early the next morning, it was time for a rematch with the Alpha T-Rex I had run in from last time. This battle raged on all morning. I actually had to take several different intermissions in order to heal up Gale before continuing the fight, but every time I returned determined not to leave defeated this time. Eventually though, my will just could not be denied, as I whittled down its health little by little until I had finally killed it. Following the battle, my Sarco was tame, so I left to go pick him up and I called him Fitz. Feeling good, I returned home, dropped off my new goodies, and went out to collect fiber in order to make him a new saddle. While out chopping weeds with the sickle, I ended up running into a 145 Maywing just swimming around my pond. Never being one to turn down a good flyer though, I decided to net and knock it out. While he was sleeping, I attempted to try and make some fish baskets, but that's when I realized I needed fungal wood in order to make these. And unfortunately, fungal wood could only be obtained on the bad side of the map. So for now, I just made a saddle for Fitz, then I left to find a mission terminal. Once I had located a mission terminal, I used it to start trying to refresh my memory on what needed to get done. You see, in order to fight the Gen 2 boss, you need to complete all the missions for each tier. Some of the missions are pretty reasonable, but some of them are supposed to be near impossible to do. The good news is, though, that every time you do manage to complete a mission, they do give you a reward. There are 52 different missions in total, and in order to defeat Alpha Rockwell, I was gonna have to do all of them. So after I refreshed myself on all the missions and started to figure out what needed to be done, I decided to return home to my base where I picked up our new Maywing. I took this guy out on his inaugural flight, and I decided to name him Milkshake. But while out on our joyride, I came across a 140 gas bags. And since I wasn't able to use the Tek Suit yet, I could definitely use this. So I went home to prep by picking up my gate trap and crafting some tranks. I wasn't sure if you could trap at gas bags like this, but I thought it was worth a try. So I netted him and attempted to throw the gates over top of it, which a little surprisingly ended up working. And after a plethora of arrows later, it was out. Now that he was sleeping holding a grip of berries, there was one more thing I wanted to try to find today. That being a queen bee, because I had no idea where they could spawn, so of course I went to the spawn map to try and find some. However, even with the knowledge of spawn locations, I didn't really have any luck with that today. The next day I left again with the intention to bring home a bee. This time I did manage to find a hive up high on the top of a cliff. So I ghillie suited up and began shooting arrows at it from afar in an effort to break out the queen. I did successfully manage to get the queen bee out of the hive, but it began flying off in the other direction. Unfortunately, because of this, I was forced to sit there and wait for it to get close enough to feed. With a great deal of patience later, plus a good leap, I did finally manage to tame it. With that now being done, I decided to turn it into a beehive so I could keep it in my pocket. Back at home, I gave it to Stan in order to protect it until I was ready to use it. Next, I figured I looked like a caveman for long enough, so I made up some scissors and a cooking pot to make some purple dye. That way I could properly sport my classic Fender Viking look. While doing this, I also noticed all the holiday things were craftable inside the cooking pot. For the price of coal and some mistletoe and some miscellaneous other ingredients, you can buy all sorts of holiday goodies. But most importantly, there was a reindeer costume, and Stan just had to have it. I even decided to bring him inside so he could enjoy the festivities for himself. Then for the rest of the day, I decided just to grab a handful of drops. That way I could continue to build my grinder pile and get some more resources. That night, I looked up what resource each color drop represented, because not only did the drop color determine what was in the loot pool, it also told you what was in the resource in the asteroid biome outside. And now that we were already 30 days in, I figured it was probably time I learned what was out there. Early the next morning, the drops were purple, which meant that element and element shards were supposedly outside in the space biome. So I decided to test it out, only to find out that there was absolutely element out there. And my research was correct. Knowing that, I decided to return to base where I made myself several pickaxes and then returned back to space, because I wanted to try and collect as much element as I possibly could. So I went from asteroid to asteroid, mining every crystal I saw. Out here amongst the asteroids, you can find space whales called Astrodelphis, literally in pods everywhere. They're actually a really neat creature unique to Genesis 2. And since I was already out here, I figured I'd try my hand at trying to tame one. You do this by feeding it element and petting it, and then following it around trying to repeat the process until it befriends you. The problem was, though, in my current state, I just couldn't keep up with it fast enough to give it the element it wanted. So I decided I would try again once I had unlocked the Tek Suit, and I went back to farming element veins. I did this practically all day, only leaving to avoid dying when the space biome moved at midnight. Back at home, I stored my goodies away and called it good. The next morning, I picked up our gas bags and I decided to name a mystery machine for obvious reasons. At this point, I figured with 52 different missions still on my to-do list, it was probably worthwhile trying to cross some off. So today, I started with a parkour mission called Circuit Chase. The point of this one was to go from point A to point B on the back of an enforcer before the time ran out. I actually managed to knock out the Gamma version of it on my first try, and since that was so easy, I figured I'd try my hand at the Alpha version. This time it was markedly harder, and it even took me a handful of tries to figure out, but eventually I did manage to do it with a few seconds spare. Then I did it one more time on beta, and since I now knew all the ins and outs of the course, I crushed it. And just like that, I had 3 missions off my list. The reward you get for completing these missions is it's supposed to upgrade the loot drop quality, and I just had to test that out. It did seem to be a bit better, but not drastically. After doing a few drops, I decided to come home and try out Mystery Machine. For those that don't know, gas bags are kind of like a hot air balloon. Their whole shtick is using air to inflate themselves and then bouncing around the map. Because of this, they are really good at moving lots of weight around, semi-quickly. But it had been a very long time since I used one, so for today, I just wanted to relearn what its flight controls were, because they're not nearly as straightforward as you would think, and it does take a little while until you get used to them. At dawn, the drops changed color to a dark blue, and according to the wiki, they were the only drops that gave you the chance of finding a pump shotgun. So today, I was going to do drop hunting with the sole goal of finding a good shotty. And I'm going to tell you guys right now, I ended up opening a lot of drops that day, and in order to save us both some time, I'm just going to show you some of the more impressive drops I found. even with the mission upgrade, for the most part I was finding things destined for the grinder. But the three biggest things I came across was a ramshackle mining drill, an ascendant shotgun, and the unbelievable find of an industrial forge, which is just insane. Pretty much everything else I found I decided to store inside of a large storage box, that way I could grind it up for resources later on. All in all, it came out to be a long day, but it was definitely worthwhile by the end. Thanks for taking a long time to load into my server. I ended up getting a bit of a late start on day 36, but I did find a level 145 snow owl out in the wild, and since I didn't have a medic on either side yet, I wanted it. Thanks to our tried and true neck gut and dino gate combo, it wasn't long before I had this thing sleeping. Turns out, snow owls are actually a pretty surprisingly quick tame, so I elected just to stay and wait till it was done so I could bring it home in one take. And since I was already on this side of the map anyway, I decided to check for beaver dams again. This time I did find a few, and I got some pace for my efforts. On the way back home, I found a singular fish basket in a drop, and I wanted to test something out. So I used it on the first large salmon I found. Back at base, I crafted the owl saddle, and I took it for a quick glide around. I ended up deciding to call her Holly. Next, I tried to drop the fish I caught into my pond, which did work, but I forgot it also destroys the basket. So now I no longer had a fish basket. I topped off this night by crafting an ascendant crossbow from a blueprint I had found earlier. On day 37, the drops turned white, which was a big deal because as far as I could remember, it was one of the only ways to get an Astral Delphis saddle without being level 120. And since we knew we already wanted to try and tame an Astral Delphis, I figured it'd probably be worth trying to find one. So as much as I wasn't keen on doing drops again, especially this quickly, it had to be done. Plus, if I did manage to find it, I wouldn't have to go out and do another drop hunting session again. So just like day 35, I went out to open some drops. Again, most of this stuff was grinder fodder, but I did end up finding some crazy stuff, including an industrial cooker. The fact that you can find industrial things in these drops is insane. On top of that, I did end up coming away with our Starwing saddle, and thanks to my drop efforts, I even came across an Ascendant compound bow. These three things were the big ticket items. Everything else, though, I relegated to the grinder bit. Another long day in the books, but at least I wouldn't have to do any more drop days. Plus, finding a cooker was a really nice surprise. I opened my next day by doing battle with a level 140 Alpha Rex for experience. It did end up giving me 2 levels, which I figured was worth it. I then came home to a colossal issue. Apparently while I was out, a Bracky had wandered into my pond and was now essentially clipping into my base, making it next to impossible to access pretty much anything I needed. But I was able to use my fabricator in order to make a set of scuba and some tranks, which I then used to hop on Fitz and go check out the ocean biome under the map. I wasn't really looking for any one thing specifically, but since I hadn't been down here a single time yet, I thought it might be good to take a look around, especially for any oil nodes. Because on this side of the map, oil definitely seemed to be a touch scarce. While under the sea, I saw a 130 Donkey, and I did remember that there was a ton of metal in the lake beneath my Rockwell base. So I decided, why not tame it? It could end up being helpful in the future when we needed metal. So I started lighting it up with my Ascendant crossbow. However, donkeys also have thick natural armor, and this one had over 10k topor. So swimming around and knocking it out took a lot longer than I thought it would, but eventually I had done it. I didn't realize it, but when I broke the surface, I realized that my underwater adventure had ended up taking up my whole night. Again, the pond Bracky was invading my base, making life real fun. Nothing's better than watching a Bracky headbang inside your base, all while being terrified of hitting it in fear of him destroying your entire base. So instead, I ignored this problem completely and took Mystery Machine out to do a metal run, trying to ease my frustrations. Later in that day, the donkey had indeed tamed, so I swam down to get him. I ended up learning 2 different things on this trip. 1, a tamed donkey was faster than a wild megalodon, but not by a whole lot. And 2, something was going on my server, because whatever it was causing the largest school of sharks I'd ever seen in my life to chase after my donkey. Oh my god. Oh my god. That is the most outrageous amount of sharks I've ever seen on my screen. Oh my god. Oh my god. This is not okay. That can't happen, dude. What's going on here? Swim so much faster than how you're swimming. Safely back at home, I unleashed my new donkey into my pond for safekeeping. And in celebration of escaping the sharkpocalypse, I decided to name him Garland. Just need stuff that's in those boxes. And I realize that you're like super comfortable in my house, but could you just take like 3 feet the other direction. Could you just consider looking anywhere else but where you're looking right now? Great, thank you. Appreciate that from you. Finally, the Bracky shifted his weight over, allowed me to get all our valuables out and packed up for our trip back on day 40. After packing, I decided to refill my trough and go out for a few Santa packages before tucking in for the night. Day 40, which means it was another moving day, but it also meant we unlocked our 4th reward, this time unlocking the ability to bring items back and forth between the sides. And this was going to be tremendously helpful, so I packed up Red Velvet with all our new goodies, like the mining drill, industrial cooker, and the industrial forge. I also decided to bring things that we were desperately in need of on the bad side, namely oil, cementing pastes, polymer, and spark powder. And since we hadn't used our reward from day 30 yet, I decided to use 2 of the slots we had open to bring Mystery Machine and Garland back across with me. Now that I was stuck on the bad side again for another 10 days, I was kinda sick of living in squalor. But I had a plan to change that. Step 1 of that plan involved going out on a crystal run. I did this by pairing my new mining drill and the Mystery Machine together. That way I could grab the crystal with the mining drill, but I could use Mystery Machine to fly around the map really easy. While out, I also noticed that the drops were green now, which meant crystals should be out in the space bio. And boy was it ever. And pretty quick, I was able to harvest myself a good chunk of crystal. Step 2 was oil. I was in need of a much more reliable supply of oil on this side, and I knew that there were a few oil veins on this side, so I made a pump and set out. Thanks to the wiki, I found one pretty close to my base. With that done, it was time for step 3, metal. I don't care what it is, you always need more metal in Ark. But on my way to the metal location, I came across a huge patch of crystal, and I figured I should probably grab that while I was out. With that crystal collected, I then finished out my day by grabbing a batch of metal on the way back. The combination of Mystery Machine plus a mining drill is definitely an overpowered duo for sure. The next morning, I set out to do an all-encompassing resource run focusing mainly on wood and stone. Then, back at base, I crafted up some building components and broke ground on a new build idea I had. I started by making a raised platform with some ramps to get up on. Then I placed the industrial forge I had found earlier in the middle of it because I was planning on using this forge as the focal point of the build. With the forge placed, I then pulled all the raw metal I had collected earlier over to it. That way I could start smelting it as fast as possible. Once all my metal had started smelting, I began starting to work on the stairways in the base, adding a set of stairs in all 3 offshoots of the platform. Next up, it was time to wall it in. By and large, I like my builds to feel open and roomy, so I used stone railings for sections of some of the walls, that way it could act as windows. I also decided to add S+ glass walls to the build. This is essentially like a reskinned greenhouse wall, but it looks a little bit prettier. Once I got those details in, that night I filled in everything else with stone walls. And by midnight, the building was really starting to take shape. The final thing I did that night was I started remodeling all the S+ glass windows. That way it looked like one giant window. The next morning, I decided to add pillars onto some of the edges, which, unlike ASA, there isn't a snap point for in ASE. So I had to line each and every one of them up manually. Because of that, this task ended up taking a while to do, but in my Ark brain, it really helped the base look a whole lot better. Once that was done, I was able to start moving in some pieces from outside into my workstation. The idea was to have everything close at hand around the forge for easy access. With the first floor being essentially complete, I now turned my eyes up to the second floor. I did this by crafting an individual room at the top of all 3 staircases and connected them all by catwalks so that each room could be accessed from another, but still leaving the middle area open. By evening, I had begun building out the 3 individual rooms that formed the second floor, and putting a roof on the space within to encase the entire base and the 3 stairwells. Doing all of this combined did end up taking me most of the night to complete though. The next morning, I finished by getting the roof overhead and building one of the rooms with greenhouse glass. With the outer shell of my new base now being completed, it was finally time to start turning the rooms above into their final form. Starting with a kitchen area, where I added the industrial cooker we had found earlier and built a grill, before finally adding a fridge and a preserving bin. The second room I turned into a personal area, complete with a bed and a road map. Then I added a bookshelf for my blueprints, and some storage boxes where I could put all the miscellaneous things I had found so far. It took me a bit to sort through all of the odds and ends I had collected, but in the end, I had actually managed to consolidate and organize all of my items into one spot. With 2 of the 3 rooms being done, I decided to finish off by adding a few details like pillars and filling in a few ceilings. The last thing I did was run water pipes up pot, that way it was irrigated. Besides one room, my new base was complete, and I liked it a lot. I don't know about you guys, but when it comes to Ark, I always function better operating out of a fully organized base. But for now, I was tired of building, so I left to do a bit of metal farming for the forge. Once the metal was smelting, I then started crafting up gunpowder, that way I could turn it into simple bullets, and then I could turn the simple bullets into shotgun ammo. At the same time as all our ammo was crafting up, I made up a bunch of water jars so we could collect our beer. The main reason I had started brewing beer so early on is because I wanted to tame up a Dinotherium, which were everywhere on this side of the map. And now with some beer in hand, which was the preferred food, I left to try and find a herd of these suckers. With them being so large and pretty much all over this map, it wasn't long before I stumbled upon a herd with a 145 in its ranks. In order to start taming these, you literally have to eliminate the rest of the herd. Once the elephant's family was cold, you're supposed to walk up to it with beer in your hotbar to begin a mini game where the elephant would do emotes. And after it does 3 specific emotes, it would be okay to walk up to and let it grab beer from you. But if you approach it too early or didn't get the emotes in time, it will end up raging at you, which means you'll have to reset and try again. For whatever reason though, it wasn't emoting properly, which I hadn't seen one do before. I even tried it out on a 140 near my base. Still, I was having no luck, so I decided to drop everything I was doing currently and try doing a server restart. And once I did, wouldn't you know it, just like magic, the taming process worked again. The next morning, after a few rounds of beer, I had successfully tamed my new 4-legged tank. Back at home, I made her a saddle and set her up in the yard. And because I still knew where the original 145 was, I figured I'd go back and see if it was there. Luckily for me, it hadn't despawned yet, so the drinking game continued. This one ended up taking me a few tries, but eventually the second Dinotherium was mine. With my pair of Elephantes back together at base, I began breeding them. While the baby was gestating, I decided to name her Pearl and the male Fudge, because everybody likes Big Fudge. Once the baby was born though, I just decided to cryo it up so we could raise it up somewhere safer later. And now that I had successfully managed to tame up our very large guard dogs, I figured it was probably time to work on our third and final room. I wanted this one to function as a greenhouse, so I filled the limited floor space with crop plots. And thanks to Blaine, I was able to quickly gather the seeds. Then I moved the dung beetles inside, fertilized the plots, and set up irrigation for the industrial cooker. Now that I had completed all of that, it was time to test out my green thumb. So I planted our crop seeds and a few narcoberry seeds in there as well. Lastly, I set up a few doors so our dung beetles couldn't just wander off, and ta-da, a greenhouse was formed. I ended up finishing this day off by making some gas and doing just a touch of resource farming. First thing in the morning, I made up a cooking pot and I dabbled in the decorations one more time. This time making a Christmas tree, Christmas sweaters, some lights, a present, and a stocking, which I used to spread a little Christmas cheer around the base. Now that the base was looking festive, I decided to take out Taruk Tau out to gather Christmas scotches and drop them off into a box I'd made nearby. Because today I was planning to spend all the mistletoe we had been collecting to try and get some Christmas presents out of the gotchas. You see, if you feed the Christmas scotches the mistletoe or coal, they will eventually drop you a crystal, and these crystals could then be opened to receive a random item. And since it was Christmas time, I figured I'd collect as many crystals as I could. That way we could open them up on our own little Christmas date later on. The thing was, I had collected a lot of mistletoe up to this point, and feeding it all to these Christmas scotches ended up taking me all day to do, but it did resort in a ton of gotcha crystals to be opened later. The next morning, I found a crazy-looking 140 Dinotherium in a herd below my base, and since I was now in the baby elephant producing business, I figured adding another breeder couldn't hurt. So for one more time, I decided to engage in an AM drinking game in order to tame an elephant that I named Cheeto. Next, I headed out to do some scouting, because until this point, I had not gone to the south side of the area much, and I wanted to see what was out there. While out, I ended up seeing a Bloodstalker, and I had absolutely no clue these things were even on the map. And while watching it, I ended up getting jumped by not one, but 2 different manas. And even crazier, one of them just happened to be a level 150. After running away to safety, I decided this new discovery was just too much to be ignored. It took me a bit to track it down, but when I did, it dive bombed me. Thanks to some fast thinking though, I was able to get off and net it in order to get some gates around it, making it a much more manageable tame. Once out, I decided just to sit with it until it had tamed out, because we were pretty far from base and I really didn't want to have to make a second trip. When it did wake up, I decided to name her Noelle, and I crowded it up. Once safely back at base, I decided to try and make her a saddle, which was pretty cheap. Then that night, I took my super jumping ice fox out for a bit of mischief, where I essentially just devastated most of the population with my ice breath, but by and large, I was mainly trying to hunt tech dinos for electronics. I had totally forgotten just how fun manas were. And because of that, I may have gotten a little bit carried away and spent all night killing things until morning. The next morning, again, I decided to try and do some proper scouting, starting with the Bloodstalker area I had found earlier. I ended up looking around for a while, but I really didn't have much luck. While out, I also started making myself blood packs, just in case I found one. I also went to the space biome to check what resource was outside the cyan rock color, but it just turned out to be stone and metal. Nothing crazy. I continued to bounce around the map for a bit and didn't find much beyond the existence of rock golem, but that discovery was still news to me. As most Ark players know well, sometimes you just can't find anything. Back at base on that night, I finally set up the heavy auto turret in my yard. Just in case a Shadowmane got up here, I didn't want any of my things dying. Plus, now that I could bring items with me between sides, I figured now would be a good time to start crafting up some ammo for that Mastercraft fabricated sniper rifle we made. Reason being, I wanted to take it back across to the good side with me so I could try and tame up a Bracky. So for the rest of that night, I focused on making ordnance for this task. The next day I made a vault, and I placed it in my workshop to help store the extra resources we had. Then I looked up what it would take to craft a grinder, and with a bit of work, it didn't really look too far out of reach. So I left to try and start grabbing the 3K crystal I needed, plus I ended up with a metal load. With that now done, I had enough crystalline oil. I was only lacking the paste metal and polymer. I was able to make some poly with the obsidian I had, but I was going to need much more. But now that I actually knew where the obsidian was, it was way easier to collect. And because I also needed stone for cementing paste and spark powder, I also made sure to grab that in bulk. This ended up only helping my cementing paste situation only a little bit, but it did get us the polymer we were needing. While this was all going on, I was also able to build a little bit more ammo for our guns. But now, I was in a bit of a cementing paste shortage. So in order to remedy that situation, I decided to take Noel for some height. While out, I ended up finding another shotgun, but not as good as my current one. And I even came across a tech sword, which would be perfect for the grinder we were trying to make. Besides that though, I mainly harvested carnivore plants for the extra chitin, which gave me a pretty decent haul overall. Day 50 was a big day. One, because I figured it was the best day to do our mini Christmas on, plus we got some huge rewards. Those being unlocking the ability to actually use the Gen Tek Suit. On top of that, we also got the Starwing saddle engram unlocked. And now that I could actually use the Tek Suit, I could actually play the map the way it was intended. Feeling good about my new rewards, I decided to open up all our gacha crystals to see if there was anything worth grinding up or not. I mostly ended up with Christmas decorations and chibis, but I did get a few pieces of decent armor and some worse off shotguns. The rest of it, however, would be grinder fodder. And since it was day 50, we technically still had to switch sides again. So I packed up some of my stuff, including the rifle and ammo. I also had one tame I was allowed to bring with me left over from the day 30 reward. So I chose to bring Noel, but not before giving him a piece of the candy we just got to make him look extra festive. I've also got a surprise twist in the video I haven't told you guys about yet. I have a friend who also wanted to take on this challenge I created, so I invited him to try it independently from us in his own video, but on the different side from us. So when we were on the bad side, he was on the good side. I say this now because I wasn't sure how he was doing, but I wanted to drop off a little Christmas present for him. I had stumbled upon his base earlier while out and about, so I put a present down in front of his door where he could find it when he got back. Inside of the present, I decided to leave him an apprentice long neck rifle, a Mastercraft shotgun, and our firstborn Dinotherium baby. I'm gonna leave his link down in the description in case you want to check out his side of things and get his reaction to my gift. Once that was done, I went back to doing my own thing by traveling with Noel back to our Eden base. Back at home, I couldn't believe the Bracky was still stuck inside my base. But to make things worse, when I went to look at it with the spyglass, I accidentally hit it with the Mana's breath attack. At that point, I just had to commit or risk serious damage to my base. Luckily, because it seemed to be meshed underneath my base, it wasn't able to get a stomp attack off, and Noel was actually able to shred it pretty quickly with its breath attack, but not without it fear-roaring and making my tame scatter. I ended up being able to find most of them again, just not my backup Maywing Milkshake. So as of right now, he was MIA. With the catastrophe now being over, I realized that my friend had a similar idea as me and decided to leave me some presents as well. Being a Thylachibi, a Mastercraft double barrel, and an apprentice chainsaw. The second box included a few Maywing eggs. Out of everything, the chainsaw in particular would be very helpful. After this, I decided to try out the Tek Suit for the first time. Just like Iron Man, this thing was fast. And with my newfound powers, I went back to my Rockwell base to pick up Mystery Machine, who I had gave a load of fungal wood in order to bring back across with me. Once he was safely moved over, I decided to spend the rest of my day in the space biome looking at Astrodelphus. I didn't have time to tame one yet though, because the biome was going to change and I didn't want to die. But for the first time all playthrough, I got to watch the biome change from the safety of the space bridge. The next morning I went after a 150 I found using some element I harvested earlier. Turns out, I was right, and with the Tek Suit, it was way easier to tame this thing. With the help of my new speedy abilities, I tamed my first space dolphin, and was able to bring it home with low drama. The grind we had put in for that saddle was 100% worth it though, because now I could move even faster. On top of that, while I was testing out the Astrodelphus, I found a tech generator which could be used for our Rockwell base for so many other things. I will say though that the Dolphus is for sure a traveling tame, as it offers pretty much next to nothing when it comes to fighting, but with some more weight pumped into it, it might be really nice. I also found an Ascendant Tech Bow, which would be huge when we got to use it. Then I named my new best friend Aquafina. After getting done playing around with my new Space Dolphin, I decided I should probably do a cementing pace run. This was going pretty good when I ran straight into a 150 Bracky. Not having what I needed to on me right now, I just wrote down his coordinates for later. Then I made a pit stop back at my base so I could pick up Francis, because I wanted to test out if he would be better at harvesting element in the space biome. Turns out, he's okay, but not amazing. So I took this knowledge and went home once more. Back at base, I made up a little more dye and painted our Tek Suit for a more Fender vibe. When I finished that, I ended up having some left over, so I colored up Aquafina's saddle, and that looked fantastic. At the break of dawn of that night, I headed to a mission terminal because I still had 49 missions to do. First one I went for was a race mission named Downriver Run. The objective was to get to the finish line in time without breaking the canoe, and on Gamma it was easy enough to do, and I beat it in my first try. I continued by attempting the beta version the next day, which was a lot tougher. Hitting rocks really damaged the canoe, and I was struggling a bit, so I decided to move on to something else. The next one I tried was called Slide and Glide, which was similar, but this time I was riding a Maywing to the finish line. By comparison, this mission was so much easier. I managed to crush it first try on Gamma, Beta, and Alpha. With those three now off my list, I decided to try Slipstream Sweep, which was another race mission, but this time with a hover sail. Again, this is probably one of the easiest missions in the whole map, and I managed to crush all three versions pretty quick. Focusing on the racing missions because they are supposed to be the easiest, the next one I tried to do was the Starwing Strike. This race took place on a Dolphin obstacle course, except this one didn't fly like Aquafina. The controls for this one were super dependent on my mouse, which was hard to get used to. So after I managed to beat Gamma, I figured I should probably stop and come back to it later. Altogether, I managed to knock out 8 missions today, which helped lower our total a fair bit. I ended this day by taking Noah out and killing more tech dinos for electronics. Following morning, I flew out with my rifle to try and tame that Bracky I saw. Brackies are a pretty hard tame though, because you have to aggro them and wait for them to go bipedal. Once they do though, you shoot at its ankles until it goes down. Normally, the Bracky can do a whole lot of damage with its stomp attack if you get too close, making it a pretty challenging tame. But being in the air with a Tek Suit hovering out of reach, it suddenly became very simple. On top of that, we had a super good rifle, so it went down pretty easy. Once down for a nap, I dropped out some veggies and raced back home to get narcotic that of course I forgot, before racing all the way back to feed him narcotic because Bracky's torpor drops really fast. Back home, I made a Bracky saddle and the waiting game began. In the meantime, however, I figured I'd yet again focus on making a grinder to get rid of all the stuff I had. Only problem is I practically needed literally everything to do it. So I went on another cementing paste drive. Looting the beaver dams with Aquafina, I was able to scurry the rivers a whole lot faster. I also found a Mastercraft mining drill on a drop, which was incredible. Next, I was going to need pretty much all hard polymer to make this grinder. So I wikied some obsidian locations and took Mystery Machine and my new mining drill to go grab some during the night. By morning, I dropped off my polymer and began smelting what metal I did bring back. Then I decided to make some fish baskets with the fungal wood I had brought over, and a couple cages to help trap the fish. Because at this point, I wanted to try my hand at taming a Shadowmane in the future. And they require a lot of specifically big fish. And in all honesty, I kinda needed a farming break, so I elected to focus on this instead for the time being. As I would come to find out though, this was a bit of a challenge because I was also competing with otters and Hesperornis that just naturally kill fish off. What makes that even worse is they were seemingly everywhere. Still, that being said, I did come away with some big fish, but I also lowered my standards a bit and got a couple average-sized fish. Finding big fish is pretty hard, so it ended up taking me pretty much all day to collect the ones I did. I put a cherry on the top of this day by racing back to the bracky to make sure it was narked up. I stayed with my sleeping long-necked boy through the morning to ensure he wasn't going to wake up. Then I headed back to the terminal. I didn't know yet, but I was about to face one of the most hardest and frustrating challenges on the map, paddling a canoe. Because today I was determined to knock out the remaining downriver run missions. Starting on beta, I decided that instead of focusing on speed, I would instead focus on steering the canoe without taking any damage, and try not to worry about the timer much. Doing this did the trick, and I was able to beat beta first try. But Alpha was the bane of my Ark player existence, because the time to complete the mission was cut down drastically. On top of this, any object you hit, no matter how lightly, did an insane amount of damage, leaving the margin for error to complete this mission slim to none. You literally had to be essentially perfect in order to do it, which I was not. I got destroyed early and often. I pretty much had to trial and error the best way through this mission. Overall, I got a little bit better every attempt I made, but it might literally have been a game of inches. For something that was so simple, it remained super vexing. But I'm pretty stubborn and I remained unwavering on this mission. I found that I was starting to get a lot faster and I was improving my personal best each time. I even started getting within sight of the finish line. I stayed at this mission all day long, trying to get through it. I'm not gonna lie, at this point, frustration was at an all-time high, and I was starting to have thoughts of this becoming 100 days of canoe paddling. Early morning on day 56, I had become what felt like a master of the river, and I was putting really good attempts in, when finally, with only 2 seconds left on the clock, I crossed the finish line. Finally achieving Nirvana and a much-needed break. On a positive note, however, this was supposed to be one of the top 3 hardest missions, and now it was behind me, thank God. After giving myself a breather and giving myself a little bit of time to compose myself, I left to pick up our new Bracky and take him out for a test drive. Besides the Strider, a Bracky might just be the best resource gathering creature in the entire game. And for some reason, he just gave me elf vibes, so I decided to name him Buddy. And really, that's all I focused on, just a nice, calming resource run for metal, obsidian, stone, and flint. The Bracky is incredibly slow on land, but is absolutely my favorite creature from Ark Editions, and I just can't wait for it to come to ASA officially. While out, I may have also released my frustrations on an Alpha Raptor or two, but we don't need to talk about that. I ended up enjoying the resource farming with Buddy so much that I elected to take him on a walk back home, where I unloaded my enormous haul, made more hard poly, and did an overall resource count. And that's when I realized I was still short on electronics. So you guys know the drill, and out on a well I went to once again bully tech creatures. And honestly, I didn't have very good luck finding very many, so instead I did a bit of a silica pearl run, which I then converted into the remaining electronics I needed. I logged in on day 57 to a wild 135 Stegel just walking around inside my base. But at least it wasn't a Bracky. Regardless, I had a new goal in mind for today. If our main workshop was going to be on the Rockwell side, then I was going to turn this side into my baby hatching / raising area. But first, in order to do that, I was going to need some more crystal. So I took Buddy out for a while to farm some. That's when I remembered I was farming for a grinder earlier, and looking at the requirements, I thought we may actually be close. So I took Buddy through the lake like the Loch Ness Monster to finish my crystal run, and even encountered beaver dams. After I used Mystery Machine to unload the supplies back faster at base, so I could return and put in another quick metal and obsidian run with Buddy. The combination of Buddy with Mystery Machine really sped up the process considerably. Back at base in the afternoon, it looked like all we were missing after all the polymer crafted was oil and metal. Plus, we already had the metal, it just needed to smelt first. So while the metal was smelting, I took Garland back down into the ocean to harvest oil nodes. See, Garland was handy after all. I came out of the ocean in the morning with the oil we needed, So in order to expedite the process, I made more refining forges and split the metal up. After doing all the miscellaneous farming and missions, I really just needed a more relaxing day. And because I was just waiting for the metal to smelt down so we could grind up all our loot, I figured why not grab a bit more? Kinda like throwing fuel on the fire. That evening, I had done it. After many hard days' work, a grinder was in my possession. And now, it was time for the fun part. First, I had to assemble my dragon's hoard of loot in the grinder, which after the wealth I had amassed, it did take me a bit to consolidate it all into one place, where I could then hit the magic button. Now, I don't know what I was expecting to happen, but this was 100,000 times better. In fact, I'm pretty sure I beat Ark with this grind. Instantaneously, all our hard work picking up drops paid off. And since I now had a ton of organic polymer, I didn't want it to go all to waste by spoiling. So I decided to make a ghillie suit out of the Raptor Claws blueprints I had. But first, because I was rich now, I built a new chem bench and a generator for this base, just for a bit of ease of access and to make some stimulant. The next day I made up a grill and I used a well to kill a brachy for some prime meat, where I learned that surprisingly, brackies were worth pretty good experience. With my new grill, I fried up the prime, and with my stimulant from earlier, I headed to the cooking pot, because not only was I going to make a ghillie suit, I was going to craft the very best one possible. In order to do that though, I needed some mind wipe tonics. That way I could respec all my levels and put them into crafting skill and see what bonuses I could get on our ghillie pieces. By the end of me crafting up ghillie suit pieces, this brass suit may as well have been an iron suit. Then I used a second mind wipe to fix all my stats. Next, it was time to build that baby area I was talking about earlier. To do this, I used some greenhouse glass to build a lower floor over the top of the water, but under the land bridge. Once I was happy with the shape, I outlined it with metal railings. With the top done, then I used wooden railings to encase and close off the pond from the lake. I finished it the next morning, and I put the cherry on top by adding an egg incubator to the mix for eggs. Now that the bases are done on both sides, let me know in the comments which base you guys prefer. I could definitely make pros and cons for both. And since I actually had my own pond built, I decided to let my fish wander so he could enjoy his new enclosure. For today's reward, I unlocked the ability to travel between the sides freely. At long last, we would have the entire map to our disposal, all the time. But first, I needed to do a bit of maintenance on the Rockwell base. I did this by bringing over a grinder and grinding up the stuff I had on the other side. This resource pile wasn't nearly as juicy, but still, free resources were always helpful. Then I traveled to Eden to pick up my tech stuff, because now that I had found a tech generator, I wanted to test it out in some of the other stuff I had found, starting with a sleeping pod. But I didn't know the engrams for that, so I couldn't actually use it. Then I placed my tech prop plots because I didn't know what all they did, and to be fair, I still don't really know what they do. But I had found a few, so why not use them? Next, I placed my tech troughs, because as a rich Ark man, I just have to live fancy. I also placed a tech transmitter in my front yard, simply because I had one. Kind of a lazy day, but I was excited nonetheless. The next day, I bred up my Dinotheriums, and I got a set of twins out of it, so I cryoed them up for later. Next, I went out into the space biome because supposedly there was some mutagel out here on an orange day. However, I was only finding black pearls. I stayed out looking for a bit, but still had nothing, so I decided to leave for other ventures. I knew there were plants that gave rare flowers over here on the bad side, and I was hoping the Tek Stego could grab some, but I also wasn't really having any luck with that. I was able to get a bit though, on top of the ones I already had. So now, many days later, I have finally felt comfortable putting down our beehive. That way we could get some honey production started. The next morning I took Mystery Machine and my mining drill out to get specifically fungal wood. While out in the wild zapping trees, I found a 130 featherlight, and since I needed at least one glow pet, this would do. So I fed some mushrooms to tame it up, and I named him Kringle. Then I went back home and used the fungal wood to make even more fish traps, because a shadow mane would take way more to tame. Now that I was armed with some new fish baskets, this afternoon became all about the big fish. By sunset, I had enough big fish that I felt willing to go after my first shadow mane. On day 63, the crates were white, meaning mutagel could be found in the space biome. That's important because besides completing the missions, the boss fight required mutagen, and 800 mutagel creates 6 mutagen. So I was hoping to take advantage of this today, and I went out to grab a bit. But while out in the space biome, something truly unfortunate happened. I had Mystery Machine follow me around while I mined the rocks. At one point, I whistled for him to stop, and without me noticing, my guy decided to propel himself out into space. But because I was more focused on the mutagel, I didn't realize Mr. Machine wasn't there, until it was too late. I ended up looking around for a good while, searching the numerous asteroids back and forth in the space file. But despite all my searching, I just couldn't find him, and my boy was lost to the vastness of space. You can't track creatures in ASE like you can in ASA, so after a while with no luck, I begrudgingly gave up, assuming he must have been abducted. However, I did put out an SOS in regards to anyone who might have information on his whereabouts. I then tried to get my mind off of that by going shadow maintaining. After spending the amount of time we did on Rockwell's side, I already spotted a cat I wanted for quite some time. A level 145 female. Shadow mains are a passive tame, requiring fish to feed to it when it lays down. To make this easier, I built a box and used Haruk to pick it up and drop it in. Once in the box, I put on my new ghillie suit so it wouldn't notice me as easily and crept up to feed it the fish through the wall. And as long as you don't move much, you can easily keep feeding it fish until it was tame. Thanks to this trick, I ended up with my first shadow main, who I named Ribbon. So I decided to take her over to the good side, where I spent the remainder of the day laying waste to everything, including a couple of alphas to power level her up. The next day I took my baby Dinotheriums over to the daycare to start raising up, and I did a fairy run with Trumpet to keep them fed. After that, I went back over to the Rockwell area because for the first time I wanted to check out Rockwell's lair, which is an enormous underground cave filled with aberrations. More importantly though, it held the boss terminal inside it, which I needed to check how much mutagel I'd need. The second reason I wanted to come in here was because this area spawned Creeper Queens, and I wanted to check for and clear out the low level ones, giving me a better chance of getting a higher level one to spawn. I did this by leading the low level ones into an acid pit below the terminal. During the night, I started crafting up more shotgun ammo and gunpowder using Buddy to get wood and the forge to burn it down quickly into charcoal. I was still focusing on gunpowder and bullet manufacturing when one of my baby Dinotheriums just died. As it turns out, these babies required a lot more berries than I had thought, but thankfully I was quick enough to stop the others from starving as well. Clearly, I need a lot more berries in the future. While over at the good side, I decided to pick up as much charcoal as Aquafina could carry. That way I could take it to the Rockwell base and convert it into more gunpowder and even more ammo. That way I'd have plenty for missions. Then I took Buddy out for fungal wood so I could create even more fish baskets because I needed a mate for Ribbon. I took this new batch of fish baskets back across in order to engage in some more fishing, but this time I had a new secret weapon. I remembered the Tek helmet had an ability I could turn on that shows you the outline of nearby creatures, making seeing big fish so much easier to do, which was good because I needed about 15 more fish for another Shadow Main. It took me the majority of the next day to find all the fish I was going to need. Thanks to the visor ability, I also found Milkshake out in the wild, and I was finally able to bring him home safe and sound. Finding a fish over 1.6 in size is hard enough, but finding multiple of them in a row just takes time in order to do. But by sundown, I had enough. At this point, the kids were still doing well at base, so I had time to go back and search for a Shadow Main. And it nearly cost me everything. Wait. Oh my god. Oh my god, I almost went outside when the thing was shifting. Oh my god. I almost went out into the middle. I went out there at 23:59, bro. Thank God I checked the time and turned around. That was so incredibly close. Oh my god. If you get caught in space during biome change, I'm pretty positive it will kill you. But thanks to some quick thinking, I was able to save the day. The next morning I had a 150 mil Shadow Main in my sights. Using the same method as before of dropping it into a box, this tame similarly went off without a hitch. At base, I named him Tinsel and bred it with Ribbon. While waiting for the gestation, I took a trip over to my pond where I released my leftover fish and then put them on wandering just like a real-life koi pond. While here, I checked on and imprinted the Ellies before returning to the birth of my new Shadow Main. Next, I went back inside the Hell Cave to clear out Reaper spawn. This time though, the mutagen symbol was there. This means that there is harvestable mutagen in the area. And I desperately needed mutagen, so I tried finding that as well. Problem is, this cave is massive, and mutagen bulbs don't actually render in until you're nearly right on top of them. These two things combined drove me pretty much insane while looking for them. Despite my best efforts and flying around the cave like a madman, I could only find 2 of the 3 that spawned in the cave at a time. I very literally searched this cave until the next morning. Back out in the sunlight, I decided to bring over the new Shadowmane to the daycare so it could also start raising up. But on the way there, I came across another Christmas miracle. Just sitting on the side of one of the space bridges was Mystery Machine, just hanging out. What the hell is that? Oh my god, I found him! Dude, I found him! I found him! How did you get over here? What are you doing here? What? He's like not out there. He's like in here. What? To this day, and even going back and editing this, I still don't really understand how he ended up here. I had never checked the bridges because I just assumed there was no way for him to get here. Yet I was super excited to have him back. I ended up walking him out of the bridge before going back to base to drop off my new Shadowmane and start raising it. Then I went back to pick up Mystery Machine and bring him home safely, where he belongs. Next I did a trough run to make sure the babes had food to eat while I was out, which was about all I got to do today thanks to my super late start. But all in all, thanks to having Mystery Machine back, I'd say it was still a good day. I started the day by checking on the kids, then creating a few more blood packs because I was still flirting with the idea of taming a Bloodstalker. Back at the workshop, I began assembling ingredients into my industrial cooker for med brews. In order to do this in bulk though, I was missing some narcotics, so in order to make that happen, I went out to get more spoiled meat from the carnivore plants. Then I took Buddy to do berry shopping in bulk for both narco and tento berries, which gave me narcotic and med brews in bulk. Now that those were both brewing up, I made another round of blood packs while doing my late night cooking. And wanting to try and be more productive, I also made a batch of spark powder and gunpowder, and finally more ammo before doing a rinse, lather, repeat sort of idea for even more blood bags until morning. The next day I went looking for a good Reaper spawn, but continued not to have any luck on that front. Seeing as it was also the 10th day, I got another reward. This time unlocking the ability to do missions together, should I see fit. Not knowing what missions Phoenix needed or had done, I decided to reach out to him and see if he wanted to tag along with me for some of mine. My thought being I might be able to speed through a whole lot of them rather quickly if someone else was there. In the meantime though, I zipped back home to farm up even more berries, plus flint and stone. That way I could yet again become an industrialized machine, mass-producing ammunition ingredients, med brews, and blood packs, all in preparation for these upcoming missions. After a while, I flew back to my daycare to find my Shadowmane, whom I named Present, was done and ready to go. Even better though was so were the Dinotheriums. So I made them both saddles and then brought them up top. That way I could use our Snow Owl Holly's freeze ability to get their health all the way back to full. Not sure why freezing equals health, but I won't question it. The healing ability is nice, but it did take a while to bring them all the way back to full health. By nightfall, I went to go get Fudge, my male Dinotherium. That way I could bring him back over here and breed with the new ones to try and get even more baby Dinotheriums. At sunrise, I decided to take Present out to do some power leveling, focusing mainly on Brackies because they were fairly abundant and they also gave a ton of XP, as long as I was able to avoid the stomp, that is. Besides decimating the Bracky population, I also laid waste to the rivers in between Bracky ponds. That evening, the gestation was complete, so I set up the new kids at the daycare, now knowing it was going to take a long time to raise them. While babysitting that night, I continued my blood pack production and even made up a few metal arrows. That way, if I wanted to use my combo during the missions, I could. The next morning, I went to grab Aquafina because he was holding the rest of my weapons. Then I dropped off one of my Dinotheriums at a terminal before heading back to grab the other, plus Holly and Present, who I decided to walk over in order to prevent a cryosickness. With my little team assembled and my ammo good to go, I now just had to wait for Phoenix to show up. That way we could start hammering out a few missions. While I waited, I continued to try and level up Present best I could. That evening, Phoenix came over on a Thyla. The first mission I wanted to try and take on was called Ferox Coal. The point of this mission was to track down a giant Ferox and engage in battles with it until you kill it. Except this Ferox knocks you off your tame if it hits you. So it's far better to fly above him and shoot him with a shotgun from afar while your tames do most of the fighting. Using this method, we crushed Gamma. And after a quick reset, it was on to Beta. Except while doing this one, I learned that this Ferox can jump really high.
Yeah. Oh, snap.
Oh my god! Oh my god! Oh my god! It's got mad jumps, be careful.
Yeah.
So I had to restart this time, staying well out of reach. I was able to beat Beta this way, but my guys took a ton of damage, and while I was looking at my mission rewards, a wild Thyla attacked, bleeding out one of the Dinotheriums. Because of this, I now had to go back to the terminal and do a ton of healing to get my remaining troops ready to go. The next day we took an intermission, that way I could finish up healing my guys and Phoenix could do a bit more prep, but by that evening I was ready to go. Judging by how much damage the Beta did to me, I figured for Alpha I was better off leaving my tank out of reach and just blasting at it with my shotgun instead. All in all, this idea worked until the last stage, where it summons a few minions to help it, and we got ambushed, resulting in Phoenix and his Thylas dying instantly, alongside my remaining Dinotherium. I was doing alright though until I tried to save Present from a minion in which a polar bear jumped off the cliff and one-shotted me. Well, I'm dead.
Oh no.
I think that's it. At least Present survived though. At this point, I was still feeling confident I could beat this one though. I was just gonna need a bit more ammo. So after healing Present with Holly, I went back to the workstation to smith out more ammo that night. The next morning, I reconvened at the terminal to do more missions. This time, instead of doing Alpha, I wanted to do as many of the Gamma missions as possible. That way I would better know what exactly I needed to prep for. So I started with a mission called Code Red. This one was kind of like a Call of Duty mission, requiring you to beat a series of smaller objectives in a row before time ran out. To start with, I used my Shadowman to jump over the beginning maze. Then I headed through a creature-filled vent system that led to a control panel defended by defense units. Thanks to my shotgun though, this was pretty easy. After the units were dead though, I was able to hit a console and go down an elevator that led back to my Shadowman. Then I had to survive a wave of creatures while the door opened up. The next step in this mission involved me defending 12 different biotanks with random creatures inside of them. For the next 5 minutes, it was my job to protect as many biotanks as I could from the waves of creatures coming at them. After this, the next task involved walking down 2 different hallways filled with similar biotanks to hit additional consoles. That once hit released all the biotank creatures, making it harder to get back. The very last phase involved a boss fight with a powerful Giga Rockwell was experimenting on. Thankfully, you get some help for this bit in the form of the creatures you helped save during the mission. Overall, this mission was pretty tedious, but it wasn't too bad, and I had completed another mission off my list. Outside, I healed up our stuff and jumped right back in to take on another. This one being a Volanosaur stock. This one was similar to the Ferox mission involving tracking down and killing a big Volanosaur. Difference was that this one was a lot easier. The next mission on the list was Shadowmane Prowl, which essentially was the exact same thing as the last, but this time featuring a large Shadowmane. As expected though, this mission had the same outcome of getting crossed off the list with low effort. Next up was a mission called Life Support, which involved completing a series of Simon Says minigames and fixing a series of oxygen containers, all while being accosted by dinos. For this one, I just decided to have Present follow me while on aggressive, while I flew around with the Tek Suit using the shotgun to blast and fixing some of the air brakes. At the end of this mission, there was also a boss fight involving a mech riding a Strider. Luckily, it wasn't too bad, and I was able to beat this too early the next day. Even though it was the next day, I decided to keep the mission train rolling. This one taking on one called Choose Your Own Adventure. This mission involved collecting and killing different colored things, then going through the colored portal with the most things. Made simpler, if you collected or killed 8 things in a room, and 7 of them were blue, then you'd go through the blue door. Honestly, this was going pretty well, except for when I missed the jump and landed squarely in front of Phoenix, who promptly shot me in the face, forcing me to refuel and restart. Oh my god, you just killed me. You just shot me.
That wasn't me.
Yes, it was. I landed
Was it?
in front of you.
You dropped right in front of me. Oh my god. It said unconscious. I thought you got knocked out. I was like, oh.
Luckily, it was Gamma though, so it didn't take long to get back. The final phase of this mission included, you guessed it, a boss fight. This one involved a room full of summoners that in order to fight, you must find all the corresponding colored pads of the summoners involved. This is actually a lot easier than it sounds. The hardest part was just dodging friendly fire from my cotton-headed Ninny Muggin's friend Phoenix. So pretty quickly, this too was done. I had one more mission left I wanted to focus on before calling this mission run complete. This one being called Star Dolphin. This one was essentially an off-brand Star Wars game that involved flying an Astro Delphis through a space trench until you reached open space. Once outside, it became all about defending a random Astro Cetus before the final phase, which, how did you guess, involved one more boss battle. This one being a hologram of the Master Controller's head. Even though there was another boss fight involved, this mission ended up being the most fun thus far. All in all, getting this many missions done this quickly felt pretty good. Plus, now I had a pretty good idea of what we needed in order to complete the rest. So I left the terminal in order to take care of the kids, then I returned to the Rockwell workshop. In the wee hours of the morning, I brought up my Shadowmans and the Dinotheriums because clearly I needed way more troops for these next few fights. So I waited for the mains to give birth, then cryoed them up. Then I set off to see if I could find some Rexes to add to the roster. Instead, I came across something much harder to tame, but maybe more helpful. I just wasn't prepared to do it yet. So I headed home to make a cannon and some cannonballs, and of course, this meant needing more wood for charcoal. While out grabbing wood, I made sure to grab an extra round of berries as well. I ended up being low on obsidian, so I went out and made quick work of that with the drill. With all the cannonballs I needed now being crafted, it was time to work on the Quetzal platform saddle for Karuk. Lastly, I made a new harpoon launcher and some more net when finally the baby elephants were born. I cryopotted these up as well so I could bring them over to the daycare, and I ended the day by crafting up a heap of metal gates to try and create a trap. Heading out at dawn, I went back to where I spotted the rock golem. I even ended up coming across a small waterfall cave essentially across the way from the golem, and figured this was as good a place as any to set up my gate trap, and drag over my rock friend. Thankfully, the water was shallow enough for Karuk to stand on, so I put the cannon on him, then lined up a shot to try and start knocking it out. It ended up taking nearly every shot I had, but I did get the KO eventually. Now, if left to their own devices, rock golems will take forever to tame. So now I was going to need some kibble, but not before taking over and setting up all the new babies to start raising. Once I had the babies all set up and ready to go, I then went to search for as many low-level Utis as I could because I needed their eggs for kibble. I ended up coming across a handful of good candidates, which I netted and knocked out. I even spotted a level 150 Thyla, and it was looking amazing, so I couldn't turn it down. Unfortunately though, that's pretty much all I could find on this night. I didn't end up finding all the Utis I wanted, so in the morning I picked up the ones that I had tamed out and then flew to the Rockwell side of things to look for more. Over here, they are way more abundant, and I actually came across a 145 male, and I figured I may as well snag this as well because it might be useful for the boss fight. Once this was down, I came across a few more and put those down too, before running back to grab the other Uti and the Thyla from the Eden side. Then I made my way back over to the daycare because in my eagerness I had forgot to dump more berries on the elephants and one may have starved. On top of that though, I did need to take care of some of the imprinting. That night I rushed over to collect all the remaining members of my UD posse before heading home and uncrying all the new tames. The next day the drops were white once more, and I needed mutagel bad, so learning from my mistakes, I brought Buddy out by himself to harvest the nodes. He wasn't as good at collecting mutagel as say a Strider would be, but he did way better than the mining drill did. Considering I needed a ton of mutagen for the boss tribute, I elected to devote most of the day to grabbing as much mutagel as I could before heading home and dropping off what I had. I also bred the Utis for the eggs since they were done being cryosick. And now that I had UD eggs producing, I decided to go back to the Hell Cave to check on Reaper spawns. I still didn't end up finding any good Reapers though, so I went home, where I crafted a few pieces of kibble for the golem and a few medbrews for missions. While doing all of this, I also bought some sulfur from HLNA because it's the golem's second favorite food, so I figured probably good to have some on hand. The next morning I set out to at long last feed the sleeping rock golem. At this point the golem had been starving out for days, so it didn't take long with the help of kibble for it to fully tame. I decided to name him Colossal, then I picked him up and Taruk and set off back towards home. But I also figured that since I was already on this side of the map, I should probably go look for Bloodstalkers again, only to stumble across a 140 Giga instead. At first, I didn't know how to feel about finding this, because if I had found this earlier, I never would have wasted all that time taming up the golem. Still though, this was a good find, and I could definitely use it. So I had to go home to do another round of tame prep. I also made a huge batch of gunpowder. Then I made up some more metal gates, and then decided to go over to the daycare side of things. That way I could take advantage of the grinder resources to craft some darts and some arrows. While here, I also dropped off the new Thyla and started making ammo. I even used my resource reserves over here to repair my shotgun. By the time night rolled around, the Shadowmanes had fully grown up, and I was able to leave armed to the teeth. The next morning, I headed out to do battle with the enormous lizard. Being all brawn and no brain, I managed to get the Giga surrounded by gates, turning this enormous tame into a point-and-click adventure game. I sat there shooting this thing with over 200 arrows in an ascendant crossbow. Once the arrows were gone, I then turned to my darts and my journeyman rifle, adding another 30 darts before this thing went down. With an immense amount of topor now pumped into it, I still fed him some mutton and gave it even more narcotic to try and keep this thing under, just long enough to get the tame off. Then I went back home to pick up my mining drill, because while shooting the Giga, for some reason I remembered that there are nodes inside the Rockwell cave that do in fact give mutagel if you harvest them. And even at this point, I still needed a lot of mutagen, so better late than never. Being careful to avoid the acid in the pit, I managed to collect over 200 mutagel from these nodes alone. I really wish I had remembered about these nodes earlier, but it is what it is. It's also worth noting that on this trip, I still didn't see a Reaper worth talking about. After snagging the mutagel, I had to hustle over to get more narcotic for the Giga. Now that I could ensure that he was sleeping happily, I went back over and converted my mutagel into mutagen, giving me 14 total. I spent the rest of that night once again enjoying one of my new favorite pastimes, working around the workshop prepping for ammo. Then traveling over to the daycare, where I spent even more grinder resources doubling up on my ammo production. I began this day by taking my newly raised male shadow main back across to get another breed off on the rest of my mains. With an army of new kittens now gestating, I left to grab the Giga, naming this behemoth Krampus. Back at home, I made a saddle for Colossal and Krampus. Then I packed up to start getting ready for missions, picking up all my ammunition, then cryoing all my new shadow mains and some of their parents. That way I could bring them back over to daycare and they could start raising up. While here, I made sure to do a meat run, so no funny business could take place this time. Being essentially 100% ready for another bout of missions, I decided to head to the terminal and knock out the last 2 Starwing Strike missions. And now that I was a lot more comfortable with the controls, this time both Alpha and Beta went a whole lot smoother. By the time I finished both of these, it was pretty late at night, so the last thing I did is I went over to the other terminal to drop off a Shadow Main. The next morning I continued by moving over all the ready troops I had in order to prevent any cryo-sick shenanigans. By mid-morning I had all my troops organized and I got Colossal set up in case I needed it. Then I spent a bit of time while waiting for Phoenix to get ready by leveling up my only male Shadow Main. After a while, I decided to head back to my workshop in order to make a couple of energy brews, grab my med brews, and make a few mind wipes. I used one mind wipe and restructured my levels to be more mission suitable. Then I went to my Gotcha Crystal Vault to pull out a few suits of armor I could use. Lastly, I picked up the remainder of my snacks, then headed back to the terminal. The next morning I was as prepped for missions as I probably could be. I decided to use Aquafina to hold the items I didn't need at the moment, then I uncorked Krampus and got him set up. Eventually Phoenix did show up in the afternoon, with the Shadow Main, a couple aloes, and a few Thylaks. Now it was time to cross off more of these missions, starting off with Alpha Ferox Coal. I knew I could do this one pretty straightforward. I just needed to stay in the air and blast it from a distance. During the last stage, I was able to whittle down the minions a little bit at a time with Krampus before finishing the Ferox with a shotgun blast. Thanks to the super late start, this was the only mission I could finish today. The next morning, I healed up and we began Maywing Poach. This mission involved pouring up a pack of Maywings and netting them when they were ready. Overall, it was simple enough, and we were able to finish this one off no drama. Next was Parasaur Roundup, which was literally the same concept as before, just this time the much easier to hit Paraceratheriums. Out of the 3 knockout missions, this is definitely the easiest one. So it wasn't long before I was able to cross this one off my list as well. Last but not least was Bulldog Fetch. Again, same concept as the others, just with bulldogs. The only other difference is the only time you can do this mission is at night. But before long, this one too I had in the bag. And just like that, 3 more missions were done. The next morning I tried Bulldog Fetch on Beta.
Most of those you only have to like hit. That's only doing 4, bud.
Dude.
Oh no!
Dude. Oh, I'm gonna be out for a long time. Surprisingly, this was way harder this time around, as they required way more topor to actually knock out, and at this point in time, I didn't have the resources for it. So for the time being, I figured it'd be better to come back in the future when I had better prepped. Next, I turned my attention to Beta Code Red. Using a similar strategy to last time, despite the added difficulty, we again managed to work our way through it without a ton of trouble. However, this time I only managed to save 4 of the biotanks. The boss fight was also tougher, but thanks to the bombs and shotguns, it was still doable. Once that was done, I had to heal up our guys, but so far we were on a good pace. The next morning at dawn, we went into Shadowmane Prowl Beta. With all my creatures combined, we worked through this pretty quick. I was feeling pretty confident at this point, so I went straight into Alpha. This time though, Krampus took the bulk of the damage, and unfortunately, Krampus fell to the fight. But thankfully, Colossal and the Shadowmanes were able to clutch it up, so it wasn't for nothing. After being forced to take a second to heal up and regroup, we set off for Velonosaur Stock Beta, which was incredibly easy. So again, we went straight into Alpha, and again, no issues were had. That night, it was on to Beta Star Dolphin. After doing these dolphin flying missions a little bit, the controls were a lot more familiar. Thanks to that, this one too went fairly smooth, at least until the very end when Phoenix went down, but thankfully I was still able to clutch this one out. Oh, how much health did I have? Like 600? Oh my god, that was incredibly close. The next day we attempted Star Dolphin on Alpha, and this time it took us a lot of attempts just to get into the boss fight. But when we did manage to get there, we made it all the way through. It was at this point I thought it was best to probably take an intermission and spend some time prepping before going on. Even still, I had put a serious dent in these missions, and I knew the others were within striking distance as well. So I went back home to check on the kids to find that the Dinotherium had finished and the Shadowmanes. And after having spent so long on these missions, I figured I was just going to spend some time doing some house chores and unwinding a little bit for the remainder of the day. Day 90 and the final reward. This time, we unlocked the Tek Bow and the Tek Pistol engram. So now we can actually use these things. If you can remember back, I had actually found a Tek Bow forever ago, and I had been holding on to it this whole time. The Tek Bow has 4 modes of fire, being Metal Arrow, Trank Arrow, Flame Arrow, and Explosive Arrows. On top of all of that utility, you can also put it in instant hit, which makes it fire fast. The one main drawback though is that it uses element shards as ammo, with each mode costing different amounts of element shards. And I still had a bunch of element shards from the element mining we did ages ago, so ammo-wise I was still good to go. So with that in mind, I went back across to the terminal to collect all the ammo I had for it and set it up at the terminal for future use. After that, I went back to the Rockwell cave again, this time to collect the mutagen bulbs that had respawned. And I was absolutely committed to finding all 3 of them this time. I noticed that the muted gel nodes were back, so I decided to collect those too, on account of still being short some. After combing through the perimeter of the entire cave, I ended up finding the first bulb in the second chamber, the second bulb I found before the tunnel, and the third I found in the tunnel. Grabbing 3 mutagen was pretty good, but the real prize was that a level 130 Reaper Queen had spawned in the third area. With a high level Reaper Queen actually being on the map, I went as quickly as I could back to base to retrieve a Shadowmane and our light pet. Then I returned to the cave to try and start this tame. In order to accomplish this, you have to get a Reaper Queen below 5% of its health. Once that's done, then you stand nearby it until it grabs you. To do this, I used the acid pit to lower its health quickly. Once below the health threshold, I used my Shadowmane in order to get close and try and bait out the grab. This ended up taking me a few tries to do successfully, but the second I hopped off my Shadowmane, it grabbed me. And now the race was on, because I only had so much time to kill things in order to get XP for the child. Because once that timer gets all the way to 0, my character was going to give birth to a Reaper. Yeah, this game can be goofy sometimes. But with it being a new day, I figured my best bet would be to fight the lake spiders for the experience. Getting the XP is important because it determines how many levels the baby receives, maxing out at 75. Thanks to the hydration buff on the Shadowmane and its pure power, I was able to get the 75 levels pretty quick. And now with the XP maxed out, I could now spend the day doing a touch of mission prep. I started by making 2 more mind wipes. That way, if I needed to reform my levels for a particular mission, I could. Then I spent a little bit of time gathering carnivore plants for some extra element shards, just for a little bit more ammo. Once I was happy with my ammo reserve, I decided to travel back to the good side and try to knock out a mission or 2. This time being Team Downriver Run. I've heard this mission in particular is optional, but I still didn't want to risk it either way. Thankfully, the canoe is slower in this one, making it easier to steer, and they also give you way more time as well. It did take me a try or 2 to remember how the canoes worked, but eventually I was able to knock out Gamma in the next morning. After knocking out that mission, I booked it back to base because my timer was low. Once here I set up some railings, which I thought would be enough to keep the Baby Reaper inside my base. But I was wrong, and the Baby Reaper meshed through the barrier and immediately started attacking wild dinos. And if that wasn't bad enough already, it also swam into my fish pond and started eating my fish before I was able to claim it. But thanks to Glenn's sacrifice, I was able to claim and cryo up the Baby Reaper. Then I trapped him within my base safely and stuffed it full of meat. I decided to name this one Grinch because he definitely made an effort to steal my Christmas joy. With the baby crisis now averted, it was now time to head to the mission terminal once more. Today, I wanted to try and finish all the Gamma and Beta missions, starting with life support using the same aggressive and follow strat I used last time. And once again, it was an easy dub. After that, of course, I had to call the medic over to do a quick top-up. That night, we tried life support on Alpha. But for whatever reason, when the timer hit 20 minutes left, the mission just ended out of nowhere. I'm still not really sure how this happened, but unfortunately because of this, we now had to do a mini reset just to do the mission again. We tried it again during day 93, getting all the way to the end again, and this time I was able to pull it out. It was at this point Phoenix requested a small break, so we took a minute to regroup, then jumped into beta life support that night. Once again, I navigated the 3 chambers without getting shot this time. Knowing what to expect definitely made this one so much easier to take down, which was a huge relief. The following day, I loaded into Choose Your Own Adventure on Alpha. This time, it took us a couple tries to make it all the way through it. But by essentially the end of the day, and thanks to a few redos, this mission was completed. This was another mission I actually really enjoyed doing. It had just the right amount of difficulty without it being just rip your hair out frustrating. The next day I attempted Parasaur Roundup on Beta, this time using my Tek Bow. Thanks to the bow's speed and precision, the knockout missions got a whole lot easier. I could essentially just spray down Parasaurs using Topor arrows. So this one went off without a hitch. Next we tried Maywing Poach on Beta. This one literally came down to the wire, and thanks to a few bad shots, I was gonna have to redo it. But since it was now nighttime, I figured it was probably better to focus on Bulldog Fetch, which was dependent on the time of day. This time we used tents to catch them, then shot them from inside, which was a lot easier to manage. The main reason I invited someone to try this challenge alongside me was strictly because of some of the Alpha missions. A few of these missions are nearly impossible to solo as is. And when you add the pressure of trying to do it in merely 100 days, it becomes even more unlikely. And I really wanted to give Gen 2 a proper try. So in reflection of that, I'd like to say thank you to Phoenix for being brave enough to try and take this one on alongside me. With that said, today we embarked on one of the hardest missions in Ark's history, called Survive the Ark. This mission is notorious for being a bit brutal amongst the Ark community, particularly on Alpha. This mission is very similar to Call of Duty Zombies, where you fight waves of enemies and earn points for every kill you get. There are a total of 10 different waves within the mission, and they each have their own theme. On Gamma though, as soon as I got my hands on a tech rifle, the rest was pretty much a breeze to get through. The hardest round to do comes at the end, and of course that's because of a full-blown Dodo Rex spawn. The key to defeat this pretty quick though was to save enough points to summon your own boss to fight with you. You like that?
Shooting.
I'm sick of you, more freaking dinos.
I'm shooting
Oh,
her.
there's more freaking
Shooting her.
mission.
Oh, dang.
And just like that, Survive the Ark on Gamma was done. With that mission now done, I ended up having some time to spare today. So I filled that time by taking on Team Downriver Run on both Beta and Alpha difficulty. Now I would no longer have to touch a canoe again. All that remained in my way were 2 Beta missions and 5 Alpha missions. And with this task at hand, this morning we took on Survive the Ark on Beta. This time, instead of trying to save up straight for the tech rifle, I decided to pick up a long neck in between to help get a bit more damage off. With that, I then picked off wyverns and some of the little stuff until I could afford the tech rifle, in which it became business as usual, this time using the dragon to gain an upper hand. Now that this mission was done, this left me with only 1 Beta left between me and 2 of the boss fights. The next day I set out to finally cross off the Beta Maywing mission for good. Again, the tech bow proved too strong, and I walked away this time being successful. Ah, high five!
Yay.
With 100% of the Gamma missions and the Beta missions being done, now I I wanted to focus on completing the boss fights for Gamma and Beta. So in order to help ensure that, I elected to take Grinch, who was now fully grown and imprinted, on a power leveling spree. I essentially spent the whole day just destroying everything I came across, but again, taking extra care to target any brackies I saw along the way. At the end of my massacre, Grinch was handing out 716 damage per bite. I was really hoping that having an ace in the hole like Grinch would be just enough to push the boss fight into my favor. In the morning, I healed Grinch all the way back up to full health. Then I flew Holly over to as close to the terminal as I could get her that was a safe location. That way we had some sort of medic on standby. Then I uncrowded the 10 tames I was bringing down at the boss terminal. And since I had no idea what tames Phoenix was going to bring, I just decided to bring as much power as I possibly could. That being 4 Dinotheriums, 4 Shadowmanes, 1 Yudi, and of course Grinch to round out my squad. I also brought over Tinsel, that way I could use his roar to help wake up the tames faster from their cryo sickness. While positioning the Dinotheriums around the boss terminal, I also named the elephants Kwanzaa, Hanukkah, Christmas, and Solstice respectively. I even named the Yudi Gene Simmons just for some fun. After waiting for a little bit, Phoenix showed up with his squad, which consisted of a few Shadowmanes, a few Aloes, and exactly 1 Rex. Now that he was here, I invited him into my tribe, that way he could also come to the boss fight. Then Dino Tetris began, the process of squeezing all our tames into this pad, because for some reason on Gen 2, the boss terminal is kinda small. With all our tames set to go, I grabbed my mutagen and we were off. The Gen 2 arena requires you to walk in, so I took a second to assign a marching order before marching into the arena. This Rockwell boss fight actually has stages to it. First, you have to kill a bunch of purple tentacles in a sea of green tentacles. Doing this will reveal one of the 6 nodes. Once you expose a node, HLNA will drop a mech into the fight for you to use. And this mech is the only thing strong enough to do damage to the nodes. Problem is that this thing has a limited power source, and when you run out of power, you end up getting ejected while the mech tries to charge. You have to repeat this process a total of 4 times before Rockwell is vulnerable and capable of taking any damage. And that's where the real fight begins. Rockwell does a lot of damage with a few attacks. Because of that, it's really hard to get close to this thing to do any damage. You kinda have to just sit back and take pot shots at it. If you do manage to survive the attacks, eventually you will dwindle his health down to a point where the mech gets an upgrade. It's at this point I have to transfer everything in my inventory onto Grinch, that way I don't lose it. The last step of this boss fight involves hopping in the upgraded mech and unleashing a beam onto it until Rockwell is no more. And just like that, the third and easiest of the boss fights was done. After beating Rockwell, it spawns you randomly on Eden. So after I woke up, I raced back to the boss terminal where I grabbed all my loot from Grinch. Then I started the process of bringing all the tames out for Holly one by one, that way she could heal them up. As tames became healthy, I once again assembled them into a pile before spending my remaining mutagen on entering the beta boss fight once again. I was more than a little worried going into this fight, because as you get into the beta and alpha versions of it, it gets really hard. And I wasn't convinced we would make it out of this one, but once again, I engaged Rockwell for the greater good of humanity. And once again, Grinch held the line. In fact, Grinch was one of the main reasons we were able to help break down the super tentacles. During the fight this time, I was a lot more efficient now that I knew where all the nodes were going to be. Even when it came time to actually fight Rockwell himself, I now knew that I could do it a lot safer from a distance. To my surprise, with this extra knowledge going into the boss fight, we actually managed to dwindle down Rockwell Beta pretty quick. And before too long, Rockwell 2 had fallen. Yeah! I can't see anything because Grinch is in the way. I can't see anything. Is it cool? And the better news is Phoenix only sustained a couple casualties, and I didn't have any. I successfully managed to take down Gamma and Beta inside 100 days. And for most people, that would be enough. But as I said earlier, I had my eyes on the Alpha fight. So you guys are gonna actually end up getting a few extra days, kinda like extra innings, on top of the original 100 days. The biggest problem I had though at this point was that in order to do the 5 Alpha missions and defeat Alpha Rockwell, I was gonna have to rely on a bit of RNG. The biggest reason was we needed a white drop day, that way I could get more mutagen in order to even get into the boss fight itself. And second, I needed a purple day, that way I could get more element and element shards. Because of that, there wasn't really anything I could do except wait for those days to hopefully come. On top of the RNG though, I also had 5 more missions in need of completing, but I did have a plan for all 5 of them. On day 101, I didn't log on to the server until halfway through the day, but seeing as the drops were orange, I instead decided to just relax a bit. I also ended up buying 2 of the large crates inside of the HLNA shop with all of my stockpiled points. The first crate turned out to be highway robbery. It gave me literally nothing of use. So I decided to buy one more just to be sure, and yet again I received nothing. I then spent the remainder of that day moving the resources I needed for a Tek replicator into a nearby terminal. That way, if I really did end up requiring a Tek replicator once I got the element, I'd have the ability to make one really quick. The next morning on day 102, the drops turned white. Being one of the 2 days I required, I sped away as fast as I could to get a hold of Buddy. Then I brought him outside where I went ham farming mutagen. I was absolutely determined not to need another day to get this done. I went from asteroid to asteroid grabbing gel. And in the instances where I had a cryo timer going, I just punched the rocks instead. By the end of the day, I had a lot. But I also realized that Phoenix had spent part of his day also grabbing mutagen. So I stopped at his base to grab what he had farmed that day before heading back to my workshop and converting into the mutagen. This gave us way more than we were going to end up needing. So I packed it up in tinsel so we could use later. On day 103 after crafting the mutagen, I realized we had a yellow drop day. And there was only one item a yellow drop day could produce that could maybe be of use to me, and that was a Tek phase pistol. And because I very literally didn't need anything else, today I just decided to search for Tek pistols. I'm gonna go ahead and guess that they might be a rare loot item though, because I came across exactly one of them, and it was only a journeyman rarity. It wasn't crazy, but it would just have to do. The next day was a blue drop day, which again I didn't need, but that being said, I could still find a better shotgun or even a Tek rifle. And because I could actually use Tek rifles now because we beat the boss, I figured I'd make an effort to still be resourceful and go look for one, because it could still be worth it to drop hunt. Instead, I got a Tek canteen, which was nice. I also came across an Ascendant Tek rifle, which was cool, but I didn't end up getting a better shotgun. So Old Reliable was going to have to work. By the time night rolled around, I just decided to go pick up the rest of my gear from French before going back outside to check if the drops were something useful today. The next morning I wanted to try a mission while waiting for a purple day to appear, because I had a new strategy in mind. And a new hidden weapon being Focal Chili. Focal Chili would be important because it provided a 20% movement speed buff. My first step was to focus on small kills until I had enough for cluster grenades, which I then used to thin out the large herds of dinos, while Phoenix focused on flyers. I did this until I earned enough for the Tek bow, which in this mission has infinite ammo and can be spammed freely. And with 2 people firing one, this helped a lot. The next strat I used that was a huge help was buying Dimorphodon, because in ASE their hitboxes are broken, and dinos have a tough time hitting them, making them the perfect distraction. Then, of course, the fabled Dododex round. I made sure to use the dragon to take out a large chunk of its health, and I combined that with the Dimorphodons to hold it in place while we unloaded on it. All of these tips combined together was just enough for me to achieve Nirvana and complete this awful mission. After this, I mined my one more time to prepare for the knockout missions. Finally, on day 106, my prayers were answered with a purple day. So I left to pick up Buddy one last time to go element and element shard harvesting. By around midday, I figured I had enough of both of these for the rest of the playthrough though, so I decided that I may as well hit a few drops to end off the day. It was a good thing I did too, because I ended up finding a new Tek bow that was a little bit stronger than my previous one. Then I spent a while making sure I had everything I could possibly need. Mainly I just focused on doing inventory on my ammo situation. With that in check, I figured I'd take Grinch out one more time just to see if I could get him a few more levels. That night, I went into the Alpha Bulldog fetch mission, armed with a new Tek bow. But while focusing on shooting a Bulldog, I ended up getting one shot by a raptor in the water. This forced me to miss out on it thanks to the time of day constraints. So because I missed out on the Bulldog mission, the next morning was dedicated entirely to Alpha Maywing Poach. And thanks to the new bow and some better understanding on how the mission Maywings moved, I was able to better predict where to shoot. With that one done, there were 2 more hunting missions to go. Next up is Alpha Parasite Roundup, which even in high tiers showed to be the easiest of the 3 knockout missions to do. These things are essentially just big pincushions. And before long, this mission was done too. Next up was the Bulldog mission. This time I made sure to stay well clear of any angry raptor faces. With my added caution, I was also able to finish this one, just leaving one mission left, Alpha Code Red. And thanks to Grinch, I was pretty sure I had a way to cheese it. Day 108. Today was going to be my attempt at the last mission on the to-do list. This time, I brought Grinch with me instead of a Shadow Man. After jumping over the maze like normal, I decided to bury him underneath the ground on the other side of the maze. That way he'd be safe. Then I used a Focal Chili and a Shadow Stake to help clear the vent shaft. The big time saver was bringing nets to shoot the moths, grounding them and making them way easier to kill. The next strat came after the defense unit room, where I learned if I just jumped to the side, we could wait for the door to open instead of fighting the whole wave. And once the door did open, all we had to do was rush inside. In the next section, we were able to save 5 total biotanks this time. Next, the Focal Chili once again came in clutch. Oh, I'm way faster this time. Oh my god.
Man.
As I was able to sprint straight past both hallways in record time. Now for the big cheese. In the Giga boss fight room, I buried Grinch in the ground in front of the entrance hallway. That way the Giga would aggro onto Grinch, but not us as long as we stayed far enough back. For my next trick, I crept up to the door until I found a spot where his projectiles couldn't hit me, but the Tek phase pistol could hit it, allowing me to tee off on it until I got the 20 times multiplier. It took a little bit, but thanks to these few tricks, I was able to whittle down the Giga's health down to nothing. And at long last, every mission was done, and it felt amazing. Now, there was just one obstacle in my way, standing between me and a total map victory: Alpha Rockwell Prime. Luckily, all our teams were essentially already lined up. I just had to add Grinch back into the mix. Then, using my mutagen stockpile, I was off once more into the fray. This time before entering the arena room, I courage roared everyone up with Gene. This fight was gnarly. It was way harder than the previous fights. At the beginning, I tried my best to keep the troops' courage roared up, but eventually I had to get in the mech to help destroy the nodes. However, this time I couldn't get a whole node in one go, and it ended up taking multiple tries to fully destroy all the nodes. Making the situation worse, our army began dying off a little at a time. This fight was really starting to get dire. By the time we reached the final phase, I was stuck all the way in the back of the room, only able to take potshots in order to help. Pretty soon, it was just about everything I could do with Grinch to keep the tentacles and minions at bay. And when things were at the most grim, we pulled through, defeating Rockwell Prime. Guys, this has been the most effort any one video has ever taken me before. It has literally eaten every single waking hour of my free time I've had for months. So if you've made it to this point, I would really appreciate a like. Also, comment down below and let me know if you liked it. I really wanted to do something big to send off ASC properly, and I think this accomplishes that. But now, I've got my eye toward ASA. But who knows, if you enjoy the dip back into ASC, let me know. Maybe I'll come back to Ark Survival Evolved and do another map in the future. Finally, click on the link below to join my Discord if you want to say hi or even hang out with a group of like-minded individuals. With all of that being said, I'm glad to be back, and I'll see you in the next one.
Damn! I should have calculated for this possibility. I must have missed a transform on the 15th statistical outcome matrix. Simply put, Rockwell's embedded himself too deeply into the ship's primary systems. They're failing along with him. There's only one way to ensure this all ends here. Sorry, mate. I can't come with. I'm almost out of time to back myself up. You'll do just fine on your own out there. You're a survivor. Edmund, I'm here to help you end this nightmare.
You did this to me for wanting the same power she squandered. Well, I've survived worse. I promise you, I will find a way out of this, I will.
No, you won't. It's much too late for that.
It's so bright. Helena. I'm afraid.
She knew. Survivor, this is my last message to you, to be relayed in the event of my deactivation. I was only an artificial construct when we first met. Just a shadow of someone who lived a long time ago. But in our time together, I got to become something new. Someone new. Not Helena. HLNA. Thank you for that. I wish I could find the words to tell you how much it meant to me. Human language is so imprecise. But I need you to do something else now. Find your own path. Your own destiny. Build a new world here. A better world. And who knows? Maybe two lost souls can still meet again somewhere. Out among the stars. Goodbye, my friend.